Maps of the Eastern Front don't stay still long enough to understand them. Lines stretch, then buckle, then snap backward across distances measured not in miles alone, but in weeks of fuel, rail conversions, and men who never quite catch up to the pace set for them. When the war turned east in June 1941, what began as an advance quickly collided with scale that refused to be controlled. This is the long arc of the Eastern Front. Not a single battle, but a sequence of collisions that kept widening. The opening movement came through Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German troops crossed into Soviet territory, supported by more than 3,000 tanks and roughly 2,000 aircraft. The first weeks moved fast, entire Soviet formations encircled, hundreds of thousands captured, distances collapsing under coordinated thrusts. Fuel burned in enormous quantities, armored divisions consuming hundreds of tons daily just to maintain momentum. And for a moment, it seemed like the system might hold. Inside a moving column, though, the strain was already present. Engines overheated under continuous operation. Tracks wore thin against rough ground. Crews worked without pause. Maintenance done in minutes, not hours. A tank crew inside a Panzer III didn't experience a sweeping victory. They felt vibration, heat, the constant adjustment of direction, as orders came through radios that had to stay active at all times. Then a halt, fuel delayed, road blocked, resistance stiffening ahead. I remember reading early Soviet reports that didn't describe defeat as a single event, but as fragmentation, units losing contact, reforming, then losing contact again. That detail matters because it shows how the front didn't collapse cleanly. It fractured and then kept fighting in pieces. By the time German forces approached Moscow in late 1941, distance had begun to erode the advance. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles. Rail gauges had to be changed to match German systems. Trucks broke down faster than they could be replaced. Then winter collided with everything. Temperatures dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Engines stalled. Weapons jammed. Movement slowed from miles per day to miles per week, or less. But the front didn't stop. It shifted. In 1942, German forces turned south toward the Caucasus and the city that would fracture their advance, Stalingrad. There, the battle compressed into streets, buildings, individual rooms. Supplies moved across the Volga River under constant fire. Units fought at distances measured in meters. And when the Soviet counteroffensive closed around the German Sixth Army, over 200,000 men were trapped. That encirclement didn't just bleed the front. It broke a structure that had been holding the advance together. Inside the city, the experience narrowed completely. A soldier moving through a shattered building could hear footsteps through walls, feel the dust settling after each explosion, measure survival in seconds rather than hours. Outside, the wider front continued to move, but inside, everything reduced to immediate contact. I kept coming back to how the Soviet system adapted under pressure. Factories, relocated east of the Ural Mountains, began producing tanks in large numbers. Machines like the T-34, with sloped armor and mobility that allowed them to operate in conditions that slowed German vehicles. Production scaled into thousands per year. Losses were absorbed, then replaced. The front didn't just hold, it recalibrated. By 1943, the initiative began to shift. At Battle of Kursk, German forces attempted to regain control through a concentrated armored offensive. Over 2,000 tanks moved into prepared Soviet defenses, minefields, anti-tank guns, layered positions stretching miles deep. The advance stalled. losses mounted. And after that, the pattern changed. German forces increasingly reacted rather than dictated movement. From that point, the front began to push west. As Soviet offensives grew in scale, hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, artillery firing in volumes that shook entire sectors simultaneously. German lines didn't collapse instantly, but they eroded under sustained pressure. Cities fell, Kiev, Minsk, each one a point where the front shifted again. There's a detail I couldn't shake while going through accounts from both sides. How often movement and stillness alternated without warning. A unit might advance rapidly for days, then stall completely for weeks. That rhythm, push, halt, push again, defined the front more than any single victory or defeat. By 1945, the front had narrowed toward Germany itself. Soviet forces advanced into Berlin. What began as a rapid invasion had turned into a long retreat under conditions that no longer allowed recovery. If you let yourself ease into it now, don't try to follow every shift on that map. Just hold on to the sense of motion that never fully settled. Lines moving, breaking, reforming, then moving again. You don't need to resolve all of it tonight. Let it slow in your mind. The distant rumble fading, the map finally holding still for a moment. You can rest there, without needing to trace every path. This is the entire history of the Eastern Front. Chapter 1. The Pact Before the War. There is a photograph taken in Moscow on the 23rd of August, 1939, that gets reproduced endlessly in history books. You've probably seen it without really looking at it. Two men in suits stand before a table. Behind them, slightly to the left, a third man smiles. The two men in suits are Vyacheslav Molotov and Joachim von Ribbentrop. The smiling man at the back is Joseph Stalin. This is not a photograph of diplomacy. It is a photograph of two totalitarian states dividing a continent between themselves. And the man smiling at the back is the one who proposed it. Nobody starts the story here. Almost every documentary about the Eastern Front opens with the morning of the 22nd of June, 1941. Boots on ground, shells in the air, the frontier fences of the Soviet Union being pushed over at 3:15 in the morning. It's a reasonable place to begin. It is not the right place to begin. Because what happened on that June morning was made possible, made legal in a twisted sense, negotiated and signed, nearly 2 years earlier in that Moscow room. And if you start with the invasion, you miss the permission slip. Molotov is the figure worth following here. Not Ribbentrop, who was mostly an errand boy with pretensions, and not Stalin, who by 1939 had already done things to his own country that defy comfortable summary. Molotov was the bureaucrat. He was the man who looked at this arrangement not as an ideological alliance. These two men hated each other's governments with what should have been a principled passion, but as a transaction, a deal. You get this, we get that. The northern countries, the Baltic states, Finland, Bessarabia, these fall into our sphere. Poland gets cut down the middle, and in exchange, we do not shoot at each other. For now, the public treaty was straightforward enough, a non-aggression pact. Nothing to see here, just two great powers agreeing not to go to war. What most people at the time did not know, and what Moscow would officially deny for 50 years until the Soviet archives began to open, was the second document, the secret additional protocol, typed separately, handled by a smaller group of men, covering the real business of the evening. This protocol didn't go through the usual channels of diplomatic processing. It was kept out of the Foreign Ministry's normal filing system. It was, according to the protocol itself, to be treated by both parties as strictly secret. And for decades, when Baltic nations and Polish historians demanded its existence be acknowledged, Soviet officials looked them in the eye and said, "There is no such document." The document was physically in Moscow the entire time. What the secret protocol actually established was a carve-up of Eastern Europe measured in the lives of people who never voted on it. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia would fall within the Soviet sphere of interest. Western Poland would go to Germany. Lithuania was initially allocated to the German side. That detail got revised in a second secret protocol signed in September, after Poland had already been destroyed. The total land area restructured that evening in Moscow covered territory larger than modern Sweden. Not one resident of those territories was asked anything. Not one government in those territories had a representative in that room. The decision about who would rule your country was made over a dinner table in the Kremlin by two men who disagreed about almost everything except the utility of carving up other people's countries. What I find genuinely disturbing, and I've returned to this specific detail more than once, is the trade agreement signed the same evening alongside the pact. It gets almost no attention in the standard histories, which focus on the political and military clauses. But between 1939 and June of 1941, the Soviet Union agreed to supply Germany with 1 million tons of grain, 900,000 tons of oil products, 500,000 tons of iron ore, and significant quantities of industrial metals annually. This wasn't charity. Germany was paying in machinery and manufactured goods. But the material result was that Soviet raw materials were feeding and fueling the German war machine while it destroyed France, bombed Britain, and built up for the Eastern invasion. Soviet trains carrying Soviet grain and Soviet oil crossed into German-controlled territory right up until the eve of the attack. The last documented Soviet supply train crossed the border, by some accounts, less than 2 hours before German artillery opened fire on Soviet positions. The country that fed the invasion was the country being invaded. The League of Nations expelled the Soviet Union in December of 1939, after the Soviet invasion of Finland, a country whose sovereignty the secret protocol had just quietly transferred to the Soviet sphere. The Finnish War, the Winter War, lasted 3.5 months. The Soviets won it eventually at enormous cost, but the performance of the Red Army was so poor, attacking a far smaller country with an enormous numerical advantage and still struggling for months, that German military intelligence updated its analysis of Soviet combat power significantly downward. The Wehrmacht's internal assessments of the Red Army, circulated through 1940 and early 41, reflected genuine contempt. Not ideological contempt, but professional contempt. The professional soldiers had looked at what the Soviets did in Finland and concluded they were dealing with an army that had been broken. They weren't wrong, exactly. They just didn't understand what broke it. In 1937 and 38, Stalin had executed 3 of his 5 marshals, 13 of his 15 army commanders, 50 of his 57 corps commanders, 154 of his 186 division commanders. These were not incompetent men. Some were not competent men. But they were the senior military leadership of the largest army on earth, and Stalin had them shot because he was afraid of them, or because someone denounced them, or because a quota needed filling. The Red Army that crossed the Finnish border in November of 1939 was led almost entirely by men who had been promoted over the bodies of their predecessors. Literally. The commanders were afraid, not afraid of Finnish bullets, afraid of the men behind them, the political officers, the NKVD representatives who filed reports upward, and whose reports could send you to a prison or a wall faster than any enemy action. There is a detail about the night before the invasion, not the Finnish one, but the German one, 1941, that I think about more than almost anything else in this story. In the last hours before the 22nd of June, a German soldier named Alfred Liskow swam across the Bug River, the natural border between the German-controlled and Soviet-controlled zones. He swam across at 9 in the evening. He found Soviet border guards, and he told them, in whatever German-Russian combination could be managed in the dark, that tomorrow morning Hitler was going to attack. He told them the hour. He told them what was coming. The guards passed the report up through their chain of command. It traveled through the night. Stalin, when it reached him, reportedly dismissed it as a provocation, a plant. She designed to make the Soviets do something aggressive so Germany would have a pretext. He had received, by various historical counts, somewhere in the range of 84 separate warnings about the invasion, including a message from Winston Churchill himself in April 1941, based on intelligence decoded from German military communications. 84 warnings. And the guns opened at 3:15 in the morning, exactly as Liskow had said they would. None of this means Stalin was simply stupid. The man was not stupid. Historians have argued for decades about what he actually believed in those months, whether he genuinely thought the warnings were provocations, whether he was playing for time, whether he believed he'd miscalculated his timeline. Gabriel Gorodetsky, who worked in Soviet archives in the 1990s, she makes a case that Stalin was not in denial so much as genuinely miscalculating how much time he had. David Glantz, coming from the military operational direction, has a more damning reading. The disagreement is real and unresolved. What isn't unresolved is the outcome. Whatever Stalin believed, the Red Army was not ready. And the men who might have made it ready had been shot 3 years earlier in office buildings in Moscow. The pact was signed, the protocol hidden, the grain loaded onto trains, the warnings dismissed, and Alfred Liskow's message travelled up a bureaucracy that was incapable of acting on it. All of this happened before a single German soldier crossed a single Soviet border. The Eastern Front was not a war that began with a surprise. It was a war that had been building, deal by secret deal, for 22 months before the first shell. Chapter 2, 3:15 in the morning. The weight of 4 million men. Here is a number that needs to sit with you for a moment before this chapter does anything else with it. 4 million. 4 million Axis troops crossed into Soviet territory in the early hours of the 22nd of June, 1941. They were supported by roughly 3,350 tanks, more than 7,000 artillery pieces. And this is the part that almost never gets mentioned. Approximately 750,000 horses. 750,000 horses. Not as a colourful historical footnote, but as a planned, essential, operational component of what the Wehrmacht intended to be the most modern and devastating military offensive in history. Germany, in 1941, was not the fully mechanized juggernaut of the myth. It was a hybrid machine, half factory and half farmyard. And the farmyard half was carrying a significant portion of the ammunition. The man who understood this better than almost anyone in the German military structure was General Eduard Wagner, the Wehrmacht's quartermaster general, the man responsible for supplying the entire Eastern operation. Wagner kept a diary. Portions of it have been published and studied by historians of German military logistics, and what those diary entries reveal is a man doing the mathematics of impossibility in real time. Wagner calculated what the advancing armies would need. He calculated what the rail and road network could deliver, and he found a gap between those two numbers that could not be closed. So 8 days before the invasion, he wrote in his diary that the supply situation will be tight. The phrase deserves to be inscribed somewhere. The supply situation for the largest military invasion in history, with 4 million men and 750,000 horses and 3,000 tanks, 8 days before launch, was that the man in charge of supplying it had concluded that it would be tight. The core logistical problem was not one that anyone tried to hide. It was built into the geography. The Soviet road network outside the major cities was, by the standards of Western Europe, minimal. The rail network was extensive, but it ran on a different gauge than the German standard. Soviet track was 1,524 millimeters wide, against the European standard of 1,435 millimeters, an 89 millimeter difference, which sounds trivial until you realize that it means every single locomotive and freight car in the German rail system was physically incompatible with every single kilometer of Soviet railway captured. Not inconvenient, incompatible. The Germans could not run their trains on Soviet tracks until the tracks were physically modified. The process of regauging, the methodical adjustment of rail spacing using specialized equipment and engineering teams, was essential, slow, and relentlessly attacked by Soviet partisan units from the moment it began. This matters because the German operational plan, the plan that 3,000 tanks and 4 million men were executing, depended on captured Soviet infrastructure functioning at something close to capacity. German planning documents, available in post-war German military archives, assumed that the rail system would be converted fast enough to keep the advancing armies supplied. What actually happened was that the rail engineers were converting Soviet tracks roughly 30% slower than the plan required, while the advancing panzer divisions were moving roughly twice as fast as supply convoys could follow. By mid-July of 1941, less than a month into the campaign, supply deliveries to the forward elements of Army Group Center were running at something like 60% of minimum requirements. That shortfall was not a temporary crisis. It was a ceiling. It was the actual maximum capacity of the system, and it was never going to be enough. Guderian knew it. Guderian was the commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, one of the armored fists driving east through the Soviet center. And he was brilliant and aggressive and entirely dependent on a supply system that was failing behind him. His post-war memoir, Panzer Leader, is one of the most influential accounts of the Eastern Front ever published. And in it, he argues, with some bitterness, that Hitler's decision in late July to divert his forces south toward Kiev, rather than driving directly at Moscow, was the strategic error that cost Germany the campaign. It's a compelling argument, but when you read it against the German quartermaster logs from the same period, a different picture starts to form. The panzer groups, at that point in late July, didn't have the fuel reserves to drive continuously to Moscow, regardless of what Hitler decided. The complaint about strategic direction may be, not entirely, but partially, battlefield ego dressed up in the language of grand strategy. The horse numbers deserve more time. 750,000 horses were committed to the Eastern Campaign in June of 1941. By September of that year, Wehrmacht Veterinary Corps records document the loss of over 180,000 of them to disease, exhaustion, and enemy action. That's roughly 24% of the animal complement gone in 3 months. representing a logistical capability that Germany had no means to regenerate at speed. The horses weren't carrying peripheral cargo. They were pulling artillery, moving ammunition, dragging field kitchens, hauling the daily caloric and mechanical needs of an army that couldn't function without them. When the horses died, that capacity died with them. And unlike tanks, you couldn't rebuild a horse in a factory. The rail gauge problem had a specific solution that the Germans knew about from the planning phase and attempted to execute through specialized units called Eisenbahnpioniere, railway engineers. These men worked with conversion equipment along the advancing front to systematically respike and regauge captured track. The scale of the task was staggering. German railway engineers converted approximately 11,200 kilometers of Soviet track during 1941 alone. That is, to give you a comparison, are roughly equivalent to laying a rail line from London to Singapore and back. The effort consumed more than 10,000 specialized personnel full-time. And still, the capacity achieved was around 30% of the operational requirement. Not because the engineers weren't competent, because the task was arithmetically impossible at the rate the front was advancing. There is something I keep returning to when I read through the German quartermaster records from this period. It isn't the scale of the failure, which is obvious in retrospect. It's the extent to which people knew. Wagner knew and wrote it in his diary. The rail engineers knew because their conversion rate was a documented figure they reported upward. The fuel allocation officers knew because the consumption data didn't match the projection. Everyone in the German logistical system who was doing careful mathematics in the spring of 1941 seems to have known on some level that the numbers didn't add up, and the operation launched anyway, not out of ignorance, something closer to institutional momentum, the sense that a plan already in motion, already committed at 4 million men and 750,000 horses, could not be stopped simply because the man in charge of supplies had written tight in his diary. On the Soviet side, the opening hours of Barbarossa produced a kind of command paralysis that is almost impossible to describe without doing injustice to its scale. Red Army units on the western frontier were caught in their barracks, some still half-dressed. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground in rows. Entire divisions ceased to exist in hours, not days. And through all of this, the communications channels running back to Moscow were either cut by German action or, and this is documented, simply not used, because commanders were afraid to report the truth of what was happening. Reporting accurately could be interpreted as defeatism. Defeatism had a legal definition. The legal definition had consequences. Men had been shot for it before the war. So the reports that travelled upward in the first hours were partial, confused, and in some cases optimistically incorrect. The first major official Soviet communiqué of the day described the situation as controllable. The Germans advanced at a pace that no army in history had managed before. The three army groups, North, Center, and South, drove into Soviet territory along a front roughly 1,800 miles wide, their panzer spearheads pushing 40, 60, 80 kilometers per day, leaving vast pockets of Red Army troops cut off and encircled behind them. The tactical performance was extraordinary by any measurement. The men at the front were winning every engagement. And behind them, in the rail yards of occupied Poland, the supply trains were running at 60% of what those men needed to keep winning. The gap between battlefield brilliance and institutional capacity was already fatal. The armies just didn't know it yet. Chapter 3. 665 miles of silence, the Encirclements. The German estimate was 665,000 prisoners. That number comes from Army Group South's records for the battle around Kiev in September of 1941. Other sources have suggested lower figures. Soviet records that were eventually declassified gave somewhat different numbers. But even the conservative estimates put the prisoner total at well over 400,000 men. To give that number some context, the United States Army put approximately 300,000 soldiers ashore in Normandy across the entire first month of the 1944 campaign. Kiev, in 2 weeks, consumed more Soviet soldiers than D-Day put ashore in a month, and Kiev was one encirclement of many. The summer and autumn of 1941 was a sequence of pockets, each one larger than the imagination wants to process. Minsk in late June, with somewhere between 290,000 prisoners taken. Smolensk in August, more than 300,000. Uman in August, over 100,000. Then Kiev in September, the largest. Then Vyazma and Bryansk in October, which trapped something close to another 600,000 men during the opening phase of the German drive toward Moscow. By December of 1941, 6 months into the campaign, the Red Army had lost approximately 4 million men, killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Of the prisoners, perhaps 3 million were in German camps by that winter. Of those 3 million, somewhere around 60% would die before the war ended. Not in battle, in fields surrounded by wire. I want to be precise about the Kiev encirclement specifically, because it illustrates something about the Soviet command system that no purely operational history can capture. The military case for withdrawing the forces around Kiev, pulling back to avoid the pocket, was clear and documented. Georgy Zhukov, who was chief of the General Staff at the time, argued for exactly this in a meeting with Stalin in late August, roughly 3 weeks before the encirclement was complete. He didn't just suggest it, he presented a formal military recommendation. Stalin rejected it. According to Zhukov's post-war memoir, Stalin dismissed the recommendation and relieved Zhukov of his chief of staff position for making it. Zhukov's account is the most detailed available. Stalin's own wartime records, partially available from Russian archives, don't directly contradict this, but reveal a more complicated picture of the advice he was receiving. What we know from the documentary record is this: the military professionals who could see the map clearly were recommending withdrawal. Stalin said no, and the reasons were not purely military, they were political. Kiev was a symbolic city. Abandoning it before a battle was politically unacceptable, in a way that losing it inside a battle was not. The men who stayed to fight the encirclement were, at some level, fighting it, because admitting the military reality to the public would have cost something the regime couldn't afford to lose. More than 400,000 of them ended up in German hands, and the majority of those ended up dead. The mechanism of the encirclements needs to be understood clearly, because it shapes everything that follows. A German armoured encirclement worked by driving fast, curving around the flanks of Soviet formations, and linking up in the rear, creating a pocket, a kessel, with the trapped forces inside. The panzer divisions doing the encircling didn't stop to fight the troops they were surrounding. That was left to the following infantry. The panzers moved on. This created an operational tempo that the Soviet command system, with its dependence on political approval at every level, simply couldn't match. Soviet commanders needed permission to move their units. Permission took time. By the time permission arrived, the German armoured columns were already somewhere else entirely. Inside those pockets, The experience was catastrophic in ways that the prisoner statistics only partially capture. Units ran out of ammunition within days. Communications back to Soviet headquarters were cut by the encirclement itself. NKVD reports from inside several of the 1941 pockets. Fragmentary documents, some recovered from captured Soviet archives after the war, some published by Russian historians in the 1990s, describe commanders receiving orders to hold positions that no longer tactically existed, from headquarters that had no accurate picture of the situation on the ground. There are documented cases of commanders requesting permission to break out, being denied, requesting again, being told the request was defeatist, and then dying in positions they couldn't hold because they weren't allowed to leave them. The political structure of the Soviet military at this point wasn't just inefficient. It was killing its own army faster than the Germans could. The Soviet T-34 tank deserves attention here, because its fate in 1941 is one of the most clarifying contrasts in the entire war. The T-34 was, by the technical standards of 1941, a genuinely formidable machine. Its 76mm gun could penetrate any German tank at combat range. Its sloped armor could defeat the standard German 37mm anti-tank gun at virtually all angles. The Germans encountered it and were shocked, genuinely, documentably shocked, because their pre-war intelligence had not accurately reported Soviet tank development. German anti-tank crews in June and July of 1941 sent back field reports describing a tank their standard weapons couldn't stop. This was real, and yet the Red Army lost more T-34s and KV-1s in that first summer than the combined tank inventory of Britain and France at the war's start. How? Two main reasons, and neither of them is the one you'd expect. First, crew training. A significant number of Red Army tank crews in 1941 had received fewer than 20 hours of actual driving and gunnery training before going into combat. They didn't know how to maintain their vehicles. The T-34's transmission, while durable in competent hands, required specific technique to operate under load without damage, and inexperienced drivers were grinding transmissions into failure at a rate that alarmed even the commanders who knew the tanks were excellent. Soviet operational records from the period suggest that for every T-34 destroyed by German fire, somewhere between 1 and 2 were abandoned due to mechanical failure, crew error, or fuel exhaustion. Second, the command paralysis described above. Tanks without coordinated infantry support, without fuel resupply, without operational orders that made tactical sense, sitting in positions waiting for instructions that came too late. The T-34 was a fine weapon. It was being operated by an institution in the process of eating itself. There is a number that I keep returning to as the proper measuring stick for what this 6-month period actually was. 3 million Soviet prisoners in German camps by December of 1941. 60% of them would die. That is 1,800,000 men who survived the battles that destroyed their units, survived the encirclement, survived capture, and then died in a wire enclosure in the snow because the German prisoner handling system was designed for the short campaign that was supposed to be over by October. The camps were open fields. The rations were negligible or non-existent. It was not an accident, exactly, but it also wasn't the product of a specific policy decided on a specific day. It was the consequence of a war being fought by a force that had not planned for the number of prisoners it was taking. She combined with an ideological framework that placed Soviet soldiers somewhere outside the category of human beings, entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention, which Germany had signed and the Soviet Union had not. By the standards of 1941, on the Eastern Front, that combination was a death sentence. After the war, the Soviet government awarded the city of Kiev the designation Hero City. The title recognized the courage of its defenders. It did not mention that the defenders were ordered to stay in a position that the military professionals had already documented as indefensible, for political reasons, 3 weeks before the pocket closed. Both things are true. The courage was genuine. The decision that made the courage necessary was something else. Chapter 4. The Diary. Chapter One Man's War. In 80 pages. Kurt Kröger was not a general. He was not a regimental commander or a staff officer or any of the people whose names usually appear in Eastern Front histories. He was an Unteroffizier, a corporal, roughly, in the 1st Company of Grenadier Regiment 422, part of the 126th Infantry Division, Army Group North. He was called up in November of 1942, shipped east in March of 1943, and assigned to a sector near Staraya Russa in the northern part of the front, where the Demyansk pocket had only recently been evacuated. He kept a diary. His diary is archived at the Traces of War Documentation Project, translated into English, and it is one of the most instructive primary source documents I have encountered in researching this series. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is so relentlessly, exhaustingly ordinary. Kröger arrived in Russia in March of 1943. His first entry after crossing the border reads, "Since the morning, we drive on Russian soil. We pass Pleskau. While in Western Germany, the spring weather is nice. Over here it is bitterly cold, and there is ice and snow." That's it. No profound reflection. No ideological statement. No sense that he has arrived at the defining moral catastrophe of the 20th century. He's cold. It's icy. He notes it the way a man notes weather. What follows over the next several months is a document of survival arithmetic, the specific, daily, entirely practical mathematics of staying alive in a war. What the diary captures that no operational history can replicate is the texture of duration. Kröger writes about guard duty. He writes about swamp sores on his feet that send him to the sickbay. He writes about fetching ammunition, about a platoon leader he doesn't like, about swimming in the river Porusia during a period of rest. He writes about a church service in a forest clearing, the regiment's band playing while shells landed nearby, soldiers singing Lutheran hymns with machine guns positioned around the altar. He was injured by shrapnel in August of 1943 during fighting near the Munga-Sinyavino sector, a punishing series of engagements that ground through his company with a methodical efficiency. He wrote, "After coming out of those weeks, we went to Munga with 80 men. Now there are 14 left, and none of us unscathed. More than half of the casualties was killed." There is a specific entry from this period that I want to spend time with, because it contains a kind of honesty that I suspect Kröger would not have been able to articulate consciously. He had just seen his friend, Tony Feustel, a man from Vienna who had earlier had his cards read by a fortune teller at a company party, receive the Iron Cross 2nd class, and then, on the same day, be killed by artillery fire on his way back from delivering a message. Kröger records this. He records the decoration. He records the death. And then he records nothing else about it. No grief, no reflection, no interrogation of what the death of a decorated friend on the day of his decoration might mean. The next entry is about moving to a new position. The diary doesn't have the capacity for what just happened, and so it records the next thing instead. This is not callousness. That distinction matters enormously. The historians who have worked most carefully on German soldier psychology in the Second World War. There is a significant body of scholarship here, including the detailed work drawing on letters and diaries, have consistently found that the suppression of emotional response in Eastern Front writing wasn't primarily a product of Nazi ideology or ideological commitment to the war. It was a survival mechanism. If you processed every death at the rate it was occurring, you would be unable to function. The diary continued because functioning was the point. Kröger's diary also contains something almost as historically important as what it records, what it doesn't record. Nowhere in the sections of the diary available through the Traces of War archive does Kröger mention, in any form, the operations being conducted in the rear areas of the Army Group North sector, at the same time his unit was fighting in the swamps near Munga and Staraya Russa. Those operations, documented in Wehrmacht rear area security reports that are also archived and available, involved systematic killing of civilians suspected of partisan support and large-scale NKVD-style operations against the Jewish populations of occupied towns and villages in the same geographic region. This absence is not a detail. The absence is the argument. German soldiers on the Eastern Front were explicitly prohibited from writing about certain categories of operation. The censorship was institutional. What the Feldpost, the German military mail system, allowed through was what it had been reviewed to allow. Me reading Kröger's diary, knowing those rear area reports exist, produces a specific kind of moral vertigo that I don't think it's honest to paper over. You have a man, clearly not a fanatic, clearly just trying to survive, writing with real feeling about his friends dying in the swamps. And the same institutional structure that kept him alive and moving was conducting operations a few dozen kilometers away, that he either didn't know about, knew about, and chose not to write about, or was prohibited from discussing. All three of those possibilities are disturbing. All three of them are probably partially true. By January of 1944, Kröger's entries change in a way that is difficult to quantify, but unmistakable when you read the diary in sequence. The entries get shorter. The sentences contract. He had been writing through most of 1943 in what reads as a young man's voice, observational, occasionally wry, capable of small pleasures. A swimming race in a river during rest period. Pride at being given a medal. The specific displeasure of a bad supervisor. By January of 1944, in the dead of a Russian winter outside Leningrad, the voice has changed. The entries are administrative. He records positions, movements, artillery barrages. He records men being killed with the same notation he uses for weather and ration deliveries. Today, the forward guard is dead. Direct hit. A full entry. The German Feldpost system, as a piece of infrastructure, is worth understanding. In 1942 alone, this system processed more than 30 million pieces of correspondence between the front and Germany. Letters, postcards, small packages. Each one was opened, read by a designated censor, assessed, and either forwarded or held. The censor's rubber stamp read, "Geprüft," examined. Historians working on German wartime correspondence have made a key methodological observation. The redactions and the withheld letters are, in their own right, a primary source. You can reconstruct what soldiers were not allowed to say almost as accurately as what they were, because the patterns of omission are consistent and documentable. The record of what was censored out of 30 million letters is itself a kind of testimony. Kröger's diary ends in the late summer or autumn of 1944. The Traces of War archive notes his fate as missing in action on the Eastern Front. His unit, the 126th Infantry Division, had been fighting in Army Group North since the start, a formation that had been ground through 4 years of combat in the northern sector, first around Demyansk, then the Leningrad front, then the retreats of 1944, as Soviet pressure made the Army Group North position untenable. Whatever happened to Kurt Kröger happened somewhere in the collapsing German defensive line in the Baltic states. In the months when the whole front was starting to buckle, the diary just stops, which is, in a way, the most honest possible ending. Chapter 5. The 900 Days, Leningrad as a System. On the 20th of November, 1941, the city of Leningrad reduced the daily bread ration for civilian dependents to 125 grams. The announcement was administrative. The language was the language of caloric management, of supply logistics, of wartime necessity. But 125 grams of bread is not, in ordinary circumstances, a meaningful quantity of food. It is roughly the weight of 2 slices of average thickness bread from a modern bakery. It is what a reasonably hungry person might eat in the first 2 minutes of lunch. As a daily food allocation for a human being doing any form of physical labor, in temperatures that were dropping through -20 degrees Celsius. It was a ration calculated to produce slow starvation, and the bread itself wasn't bread, not in any nutritional sense. The composition of the bread distributed in Leningrad during the winter of 1941 to 1942 has been documented in Soviet food science records from the period. The city's bakeries, desperately extending every available grain supply, mixed what flour they had with processed cellulose, fiber from pressed wood, with cotton cake residues, with oat bran swept from floors, with flour milled from corn originally allocated as horse feed. The caloric content of what resulted was roughly a third of equivalent volume of real rye bread. In the worst period, a dependent civilian in Leningrad was receiving somewhere in the range of 100 calories per day from their bread ration. The minimum caloric requirement for a sedentary adult at rest is around 1,500. These people were not sedentary. They were carrying water up staircases in buildings with no heating, hauling fuel, clearing rubble, doing the physical work of surviving a city that was trying to die around them. To understand the siege of Leningrad properly, you have to start with the German decision not to take it. This is the detail that most general histories gloss over, because it is so specifically horrible that it disrupts the conventional narrative structure of a battle. Hitler's operational order, documented in Army Group North's war diary from late September of 1941, did not instruct his forces to assault the city. It instructed them to surround it and leave it to starve. The explicit rationale was logistical. The Wehrmacht did not want the administrative burden of feeding 3 million civilian inhabitants. The decision to not capture Leningrad was a decision to use hunger as a weapon against a civilian population of 3 million people. This is documented. It was a deliberate operational choice, not an accidental consequence of military circumstances. The Soviet side of the siege is where the story becomes morally complicated in a different direction. Andrei Zhdanov, the Communist Party secretary of Leningrad, managed the city throughout the siege, with an authority that extended from military defense to food distribution to political control. His decisions about who ate and how much were not humanitarian decisions, they were political ones. The ration system he administered had 5 tiers. The highest tier was reserved for workers in priority defense industries. The lowest was for civilian dependents. Between those 2 categories, the difference in daily caloric allocation was not modest. It was, at several points in the winter of 1941 to 42, the difference between malnutrition and death. The decision about which category applied to you, whether you were classified as a productive worker or a dependent, was made by local party committees. The power to reclassify a person was, in that winter, the power to decide whether they would probably survive. The road of life, the ice road across Lake Ladoga, which the Soviet historians called the Doroga Zhizny, is one of the genuine logistical achievements of the war. Trucks drove across the ice at night, without lights, under German aircraft attack, carrying food into the city and evacuating civilians out. The drivers knew that the ice was thickening at a different rate in different places, that an overloaded truck could break through and vanish, that German planes could find the column by moonlight. They drove anyway. The road was heroic in the completely literal sense of requiring individuals to do things that might kill them in order to serve a larger purpose. But the historians who have worked most carefully on the Leningrad supply data, particularly Richard Bidlack's meticulous reconstruction of the logistics, have found that even at its maximum throughput, the road of life was delivering something like 70% of the city's minimum caloric requirement. It kept people alive. It did not keep people fed. The city survived at a level of chronic, managed starvation for nearly 900 days. The death toll from the Leningrad siege is one of those figures where different sources, different methodologies, and different political imperatives produce genuinely different estimates. The most carefully supported range sits between approximately 800,000 and 1,200,000 civilian deaths, the vast majority from starvation, with bombardment and disease claiming the remainder. Even the lower figure represents more civilian deaths than the combined total military deaths of Britain and the United States across the entire Second World War. In a single city, 90 kilometers of circumference, 900 days. There is a number that arrived in Leningrad's municipal death records during the winter of 1941 to 42 that requires a brief stop. The city recorded 97,000 deaths in December of 1941, 124,000 in January of 1942, 107,000 in February. These are death registration figures, which means they are likely undercounts. Registration systems break down when mortality exceeds administrative capacity. The city's population in September of 1941 was approximately 3 million. By the end of the winter, the daily death rate was running at roughly 3,000 per day. The death registration office was, by multiple accounts, physically overwhelmed. The cause of death recorded for the vast majority was dystrophia, the Soviet clinical term for starvation. It sounds medical rather than political. It was both. Andrei Zhdanov, who administered all of this, ate well throughout the siege. This is not a rumor. It is documented in Soviet records and confirmed by multiple historians who had access to party supply records after the Soviet collapse. The leadership tier ate while the dependent tier starved. This was not exceptional. It was the system operating as intended, with the political hierarchy maintaining its functions and its privileges as the administrative price of keeping the defense machinery running. Whether that trade-off was defensible is a question I don't think historians can answer cleanly, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What I want to close this chapter with is not the starvation statistics, not the death registration records, but a specific thing that happened inside the city during the worst months. The Hermitage Museum, one of the great art collections of the world, had largely evacuated its paintings before the siege closed. The frames were still on the walls, empty. The museum staff who remained in Leningrad organized lecture series throughout the siege, in which they described the absent paintings to audiences who came to hear about art they couldn't see. The lectures drew crowds in a city where people were too weak to walk to work. Attendees sat in unheated rooms and listened to descriptions of Rembrandt's brush technique, of specific colours in specific Flemish landscapes, of the compositional choices in paintings hanging in a train somewhere in the Urals. This happened. It happened repeatedly. I don't know what to do with it exactly, but I think it tells you something important about what human beings carry that cannot be rationed. Chapter 6. The Spreadsheet of Death, Soviet Industrial Reconstitution. Between July and November of 1941, the Soviet Union moved 1,523 major industrial enterprises by rail, not shut them down, not evacuated their workers, moved them, physically dismantled factories, loaded machines onto flat cars, and reassembled them at destinations in the Urals, Western Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia. The movement required approximately 1.5 million freight car slots. The freight included blast furnaces, turbine housings, entire production lines for tank components, machine presses weighing hundreds of tons, and the workers who operated them, who in many cases travelled in unheated freight cars alongside the machinery they were responsible for. The operation was coordinated by the Soviet State Planning Committee, Gosplan, under Nikolai Voznesensky, a man whose archived planning documents reveal the most concentrated industrial mobilization effort in recorded history. The scale of this operation is difficult to absorb without some structural context. Germany, in September of 1941, had its forces 70 miles from Moscow. The Soviet government was still moving factories, not panicking, not simply retreating, making a deliberate, mathematically precise calculation that the war would be decided not by who won the battles of the next 3 months, but by who had the industrial capacity to equip armies in 1943 and 1944. Gosplan internal memoranda from that period, documents stamped urgent that read, against their historical backdrop, almost surreally administrative, contain questions like whether a relocated locomotive plant should be reassembled before or after the adjacent tractor plant. The question is whether to prioritize trains or tanks. The memo is from October of 1941, while German forces are approaching Moscow. It is asking about factory sequencing. The key destination for much of this industrial mass was the Ural region, particularly the city of Nizhny Tagil. The Kharkov locomotive factory and the Kharkov tank factory, both major T-34 production centers, were stripped out under German bombing, loaded onto trains, and merged on arrival with the existing Ural railway car factory at Nizhny Tagil. The merged entity was called, informally, Tankograd, Tank City. It began producing T-34 tanks in November of 1941, within weeks of arriving at its new location, while workers were still assembling the facility around the production lines. This is not legend. This is documented in the production records of the facility, in Soviet industrial planning archives, in the memoirs of engineers who were there. By December of 1941, Tankograd was producing more T-34s per month than the Kharkov facilities had produced in the preceding 6 months. The production evolution of the T-34 between 1941 and 1944 is the specific industrial story on which the Eastern Front's outcome rested. The original 1940 T-34 required approximately 8,000 man-hours to produce. Welding, machining, assembly, testing. By 1943, simplified manufacturing techniques, welded rather than cast turrets, relaxed component tolerances where testing showed the relaxation didn't compromise operational performance, rationalized assembly sequences had reduced that figure to under 4,000 man-hours per vehicle. This is a 50% reduction in manufacturing time, achieved simultaneously with a quality improvement in the vehicle itself. No other nation in the war managed an industrial efficiency gain of this magnitude in a comparable time frame. The Americans had the advantage of undamaged infrastructure and vast resources. The Soviets had been fighting on their own soil for 2 years and still outproduced Germany on the essential metric, tanks delivered to the front per month, from 1943 onward. The Lend-Lease question is where this chapter gets historiographically complicated, and I want to address that directly rather than smooth it over. Soviet historiography minimized Lend-Lease systematically. The post-war official position was that the Soviet Union won the war primarily through its own resources, and that American aid, while appreciated, was not decisive. Stalin said variations of this publicly on multiple occasions. The post-Soviet reassessment, using both American Lend-Lease administration records and newly available Soviet military planning documents, she tells a more complicated story. The Soviet Union did produce the tanks. It produced the aircraft. It produced the artillery. What it couldn't produce in adequate quantities, and what Lend-Lease supplied at the critical moment, was trucks. 400,000 American trucks and jeeps arrived under Lend-Lease. Soviet domestic wartime truck production was roughly 200,000 vehicles over the same period. Zhukov, in his post-war memoirs, was remarkably candid about this. Without the American trucks, the Red Army's offensive operations from 1943 onward could not have been executed at the pace and scale they were. Deep offensive operations, the kind that would destroy Army Group Center in 1944, required motorized logistics that moved as fast as the advancing armies. The T-34 could drive 60 kilometers per hour. A horse-drawn supply wagon could manage perhaps 40 kilometers per day. Without the American truck capacity bridging that gap, Soviet operational planning would have been constrained to objectives within horsecart range. The whole character of the war from 1943 would have been different. 3 million tons of American food also arrived under Lend-Lease. Roughly 1/3 of all food consumed by the Red Army during the war. 956,000 miles of telephone cable. 15 million pairs of boots. 107,000 tons of cotton. The cotton is a detail that doesn't often appear in strategic histories, but has its own significance. Cotton was essential for artillery propellant. Soviet domestic cotton production in Central Asia could not meet wartime demand. Without the American supply, Soviet artillery, which became the single most important weapons system in Soviet offensive operations from Stalingrad onward, would have faced ammunition shortfalls at the worst possible moments. Stalin, as I noted, publicly denied the importance of all of this. There is a documented disconnect between what the Soviet leadership knew from their own planning data, which Zhukov and others confirmed post-war, and what they were willing to say in public. The great patriotic war narrative, as it was constructed and institutionalized after 1945, required that the Soviet people had won through their own sacrifice and the genius of their commanders. American trucks didn't fit into that narrative, and so they were left out of it. The trucks kept moving anyway. What makes the industrial relocation story genuinely staggering isn't just the scale, it's the combination of scale and compulsion. A Gosplan directive from October of 1941, archived and documented by historians, including Mark Harrison, in his detailed economic analysis of the Soviet war effort, mandated that factory directors who failed to meet relocated production quotas would face arrest. At least 47 factory directors were arrested during 1941 and 42 for production shortfalls. The Gulag didn't stop for the war emergency. It became a production incentive. The factories were being assembled in the Urals in sub-zero temperatures by workers who had traveled from Kharkov and Kiev in unheated freight cars, Jews who were sleeping on factory floors because there wasn't enough housing, who were receiving nutritionally inadequate rations because the food supply was stretched to breaking point, and who knew that if their section of the production line fell behind quota, the man in charge could be arrested. This is how the Soviet Union won the Industrial War. Not through inspiration alone, through a system that converted human beings into production units and enforced conversion with the threat of imprisonment. The numbers at the end of this calculation are stark. In 1944, Soviet factories produced 29,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. German factories produced 17,800. On top of that quantitative gap, the Soviet machines were adequate, improving in quality, and delivered by a logistics system that could move them to the front. The German machines were often excellent, but many of the most technically impressive ones, the Panthers and the Tigers, were consuming maintenance resources at rates their production couldn't replace. The arithmetic of the war had inverted. The Urals had done what the battlefields couldn't, not yet. They had made German operational victory structurally impossible before the question was even settled on the ground. Chapter 7. The Winter That Was Always Coming. On the 12th of November, 1941, a medical report crossed the desk of the Wehrmacht's Medical Command for Army Group Center. It documented 14,357 cases of frostbite in the preceding 14 days. The report was categorized under the clinical heading, cold injuries, non-combat. The injuries were happening in temperatures that had been dropping through minus 20 degrees Celsius. The report recommended the immediate issue of winter clothing to frontline soldiers. The winter clothing had been ordered, produced in sufficient quantities, and was sitting in depots and rail yards in occupied Poland. It had not been shipped east because the rail capacity was occupied by ammunition and fuel for an offensive that could no longer move. The clothing was there. The men were freezing. The gap between those two facts is what this chapter is about. Operation Typhoon, the German drive on Moscow, had begun on the 2nd of October, 1941, with an optimism that, reading the operational orders now, is almost painful. The encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk in the opening days of Typhoon were genuinely catastrophic for the Red Army. Another 600,000 prisoners, the shredding of the formations defending the direct approach to Moscow. By mid-October, German reconnaissance units could reportedly see Moscow's anti-aircraft gun flashes on the horizon. The end seemed imminent. And then October's mud arrived. The Rasputitsa, the autumn thaw season, turned the roads to soup. Supply vehicles sank to their axles. The advance slowed, stalled, lurched forward, stalled again. November's freeze arrived and hardened everything. The mud turned to iron, which was better for movement, and then the temperature kept dropping. The German standard lubricating oil, the oil in tank engines, artillery breech mechanisms, machine gun receivers, was formulated for a temperature range appropriate to Western European operations. It began to thicken and lose viscosity at around minus 15 degrees Celsius. It froze solid at minus 25. The Russian winter of 1941 dropped well past those numbers. Records from the Moscow region that winter document sustained temperatures of minus 35 and below for extended periods. German tank engines that had been running fine in October became difficult to start in November and essentially inoperable without extensive preheating procedures in December. The MG-34 machine gun, one of the most reliable automatic weapons then in service, failed to fire in sustained cold because the recoil mechanism's lubricant had set into a paste. She artillery shells fired at these temperatures saw changes in their propellant burn rates, reducing muzzle velocity and shrinking effective range. The guns were shooting shorter than their calibrated settings, and had been since October, as the temperatures dropped through ranges no correction table designed for France or North Africa had accounted for. None of this was a secret. Cold weather degrades lubricants. This is a fact known to every mechanical engineer who has ever worked in northern climates. The Finns had fought in these conditions the previous winter, and the Wehrmacht had observers embedded with Finnish forces throughout that conflict. The Red Army had developed cold weather lubricant formulations specifically for the temperatures encountered in the Soviet interior. The Germans knew cold weather lubricants existed. They had not been stockpiled and distributed to frontline units. The issue, documented in Wehrmacht procurement records from this period, was the same one that had been plaguing supply from the start. The logistics chain was running at 60% of capacity, and decisions had been made about what that 60% carried. Cold weather lubricants had lost the queue to ammunition and fuel for an advance that was supposed to be over before winter arrived. I want to sit with a specific detail here, because it concentrates the entire problem of the winter failure into a single concrete decision. Adolf Hitler personally rejected a proposal to issue winter clothing to frontline troops in October of 1941. This is documented in OKW meeting records from that period. The stated rationale was that authorizing winter clothing would signal to German soldiers that the campaign would extend beyond autumn, which, in Hitler's assessment, would undermine morale and communicate strategic uncertainty. 4 million sets of winter clothing, the equivalent of dressing every German soldier on the Eastern Front twice over, remained in Polish depots because the man running the war had decided that acknowledging the existence of winter was psychologically inadvisable. The clothing sat, the men froze. By December, frostbite casualties were, in some sectors, exceeding combat wound casualties. The winter had been coming since the first week of the campaign. Someone chose not to prepare for it. What happened on the 5th and 6th of December, 1941, is often described as a Soviet miracle. The counter-offensive that pushed German forces back from the gates of Moscow and shattered the myth of German invincibility. And there was something remarkable about it. Zhukov launched his counter-offensive with armies that were exhausted, undersupplied, and fighting in the same brutal temperatures that were disabling German weapons. But his soldiers had felt boots and padded jackets and cold weather lubricants in their weapons. The Red Army had been preparing to fight in Russian winter for decades, with Soviet equipment designed around Soviet conditions. The asymmetry between the two forces at -35 degrees was not primarily tactical or strategic. It was thermal. The historical argument that followed this outcome, and has continued ever since, is whether the winter was the decisive factor in the failure before Moscow, or whether Army Group Center had already operationally culminated before the worst cold arrived. Franz Halder, the Wehrmacht's chief of the General Staff, wrote after the war that Hitler's interference and the weather were the primary causes of the Moscow failure. Soviet historians and many Western historians working from German operational records rather than German generals' memoirs argue that the panzer groups were running on empty, literally in terms of fuel and spare parts, before December. The truth is probably both things simultaneously. An army already stretched past sustainable capacity met a winter for which it had specifically not prepared, and the combination was, if not decisive in an absolute sense, certainly irreversible. The offensive that was going to be over before autumn wasn't over before winter, and winter had arrived armed. Post-war German military writing has a consistent habit of reaching for the weather as an explanation for specific failures on the Eastern Front, in a way that is sometimes accurate and sometimes a displacement of institutional accountability onto meteorological forces. The winter mattered. Nobody is arguing it didn't matter. But the winter didn't decide to leave the lubricants in Germany. The winter didn't keep the winter clothing in Polish depots. The winter didn't produce a planning assumption that the campaign would be concluded in 3 months. Those were decisions made by men, documented in records. It and the weather became decisive, partly because human choices had made it so. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because it determines whether you interpret the failure before Moscow as a stroke of Russian geographic luck, or as the logical consequence of a plan that was too brittle to absorb the friction that every plan eventually encounters. One thing that gets lost in the Moscow winter narrative is what December of 1941 actually looked like, from the German frontline soldiers' perspective. Not the strategic picture. The strategic picture is clear in retrospect. From inside a dugout near Istra or Klin, what the winter meant was that your weapon might not fire in the morning. That your hands, if you removed your gloves to clear a jam, could sustain frostbite in minutes. That the man in the next fighting position might be dead, not from enemy action, but from cold, and you'd find out at dawn when he didn't respond. Kurt Kröger's diary from the following winter, 1942-43, describes guard duty at -20 as a routine administrative fact recorded without drama. The men who survived the winter of 1941 learned to survive it. They learned at the cost of 130,000 frostbite casualties in Army Group Center alone between October and January. Chapter 8. Stalingrad, the Cauldron and the Telegram. There is an entry in a Luftwaffe airlift operations log from the 11th of December, 1942, that stops me every time I read it. On that day, 154 aircraft attempted to reach the Stalingrad pocket. 46 aircraft reached it. They delivered 140 tons of supplies. The minimum daily requirement of the 300,000 men trapped inside the pocket was 750 tons. The log entry for December 11th is signed and initialed in routine administrative fashion, the way a warehouse manager signs off a partially filled order. 140 tons. Signed. Filed. As though a 37% delivery rate was simply the operational reality to be noted and moved on from. To understand how 300,000 German soldiers ended up trapped in an industrial city on the Volga River in November of 1942, you need to go back to the planning logic of the summer campaign. The German southern offensive of 1942, Fall Blau, Case Blue, had two objectives that were pursued simultaneously. The Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad, a city whose name carried symbolic weight precisely because it was Stalin's name on a map. Operationally, these two objectives pulled against each other, stretching army groups south along an increasingly long and thinly held line. The flanks of the Stalingrad position were held not by German units, but by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian formations. Armies that were less well-equipped, less experienced, and critically equipped with anti-tank guns that were entirely inadequate against the Soviet T-34. Romanian anti-tank crews in the Stalingrad sector were working with 37mm weapons that had been functionally obsolete since 1941. They had been requesting more capable guns for months. The requests had been denied. The Germans were allocating their better anti-tank systems to German formations. Soviet Stavka, planning for the encirclement of Stalingrad, Operation Uranus, was built precisely around this disparity. The plans struck not at the German Sixth Army in the city, but at the Romanian flanks on either side of it. The intelligence work behind this decision was meticulous. Soviet reconnaissance had documented the Romanian dispositions, their weapons, their defensive depth, and their anti-tank capability. The attack was calibrated to break through a line that could be broken, then curl around the German forces in the city and link up behind them. This is documented in Soviet Stavka operational planning records. On the 19th of November, 1942, the southwestern attack went in against the Romanian Third Army, north of Stalingrad. The Romanians collapsed in approximately 48 hours. The southern arm of the encirclement launched the following day against the Romanian Fourth Army. By the 23rd of November, the two Soviet pincers had met near the town of Kalak. The Sixth Army was surrounded. What happened next is one of the most documented command failures of the entire war, and it still manages to be astonishing. On the 22nd of November, the day before the pocket was fully sealed, Paulus sent a radio message to Hitler requesting authorization to break out southwestward toward the German relief forces. The message was specific, militarily justified, and urgent. Hitler's reply came the same day. The Sixth Army would hold its positions. Stay in the pocket. An airlift would supply the army. A relief operation would reach them. Don't move. This exchange, documented in German military signal corps records, is the moment from which all subsequent Stalingrad catastrophe flows with terrible and avoidable logic. Paulus, who was a competent staff officer of considerable intelligence, obeyed. He waited. Goering's promise that the Luftwaffe could supply the pocket by air is one of those moments where it becomes genuinely difficult to distinguish between strategic delusion and deliberate institutional dishonesty. Luftwaffe planning staff had calculated that the trapped army required a minimum of 500 tons per day. Some estimates put it at 750 tons, the maximum realistic capacity of available Ju-52 transport aircraft. In the weather conditions prevailing over the Volga steppe in November and December, had been assessed by Luftwaffe operational planners at somewhere between 200 and 350 tons per day under good conditions. Goering either did not review these assessments or reviewed them and told Hitler something different. Chief of Staff Hans Jeschonek reportedly had reservations, but did not make them clearly enough for them to alter the decision. What followed was an airlift that delivered, across its entire operation of 71 days, a total of approximately 8,300 metric tons, roughly 117 tons per day, against the stated minimum of 500. Every German soldier in the pocket received on average from the airlift the equivalent of roughly 350 grams of food per day, nearly identical to the lowest starvation ration then being distributed to Leningrad's civilian dependents. The city itself needs to be understood as a physical environment that the battle had created. Stalingrad in November of 1942 was not a city in any meaningful sense. It was a battlefield that had once been a city. Several kilometers of industrial installations, tractor factories, apartment blocks, and grain elevators, running along the west bank of the Volga, much of it rubble, and much of that rubble contested at room-by-room range. The Germans called this form of fighting Rattenkrieg, rat war, and the term captures something true about it. Standard military tactics don't function in a space where the distance between friendly and enemy forces can be measured in meters or floors. Artillery can't be brought in at ranges that close. Air support is useless when the target and the shooter are in the same building. Tank guns can't depress far enough to hit targets in adjacent rooms. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army, understood this and deliberately engineered for it. His tactical doctrine called for maintaining the closest possible contact with German lines, hugging the enemy, to deny German forces the range they needed for their advantages in air power and artillery to function. Chuikov knew he was fighting a weaker force tactically. He chose the terrain that neutralized the advantage. The promotion of Friedrich Paulus to General Field Marshal by Hitler on the 30th of January 1943, the day before Paulus surrendered, is one of the most precisely calibrated acts of pressure in the entire war. Hitler noted in making the promotion that no Prussian or German field marshal had ever been captured alive. The implication was explicit. Paulus was being given a rank and its associated history as an instruction to die rather than surrender. Hitler's note making this point is documented. Paulus absorbed this, considered it, and on the 31st of January, surrendered in the basement of a bombed-out department store in central Stalingrad, in full uniform. He was photographed with a facial tic he could not control. 22 other German generals surrendered the same day or shortly after. Of the 91,000 German and Axis soldiers taken prisoner in the Stalingrad pocket, approximately 5,000 to 6,000 would survive Soviet captivity and return to Germany. The rest died in camps of disease, malnutrition, cold, or the compounding consequences of the condition in which they'd arrived. The airlift's final accounting is a document in the physics of institutional wishful thinking. 4,487 transport sorties over 71 days, delivering 8,300 tons of supplies. The army needed somewhere between 35,000 and 53,000 tons to be sustained for that period. The shortfall wasn't a percentage, it was a different order of magnitude entirely. The 6th Army survived on the airlift, the way a man might survive a famine by eating what wildlife he could catch. Not sustainably, not adequately, but enough to keep functioning and dying simultaneously for several weeks until both processes concluded. The last radio transmission from inside the pocket was logged on the 2nd of February 1943 at 6:45 in the morning. All ammunition expended, all weapons rendered inoperable. Then silence. What Stalingrad changed is not primarily what it destroyed, though what it destroyed was enormous. What it changed was the credibility of the German command system with its own officer corps. After Stalingrad, senior Wehrmacht officers, who had for years suppressed private doubts about Hitler's operational judgment, began, cautiously and with enormous personal risk, to not suppress them quite so completely. The doubts didn't produce a different outcome. The command culture of the Wehrmacht was by this point too far gone in its habit of obedience for doubts alone to alter behavior at scale. But Stalingrad produced a category of knowledge, the knowledge that the command system would sacrifice an entire army rather than admit a tactical error that couldn't be unlearned. Chapter 9. Prokhorovka and the Myth of the Biggest Tank Battle. In the summer of 1943, the Soviet Union was producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. The arithmetic of the Eastern Front had been shifting through the previous year, through Stalingrad, through the factory relocations in the Urals, through the steady accumulation of Lend-Lease trucks and food and cable and cotton. By the spring of 1943, the Red Army had rebuilt enough armored strength to hold a major defensive position and still have reserves. The question was where. The answer was the Kursk salient, a large bulge in the front line centered on the city of Kursk, jutting westward into German-held territory, flanked on the north by German forces around Orel, and on the south by German forces around Kharkov. It was obvious. Both sides knew it was obvious. The Soviets spent 9 months preparing to defend it. The German assault on Kursk, Operation Citadel, was delayed repeatedly through the spring of 1943. Hitler kept postponing, waiting for new tank models to be ready. The Panther medium tank and the Tiger heavy tank were to be the spearheads of the offensive, qualitatively superior machines that would penetrate Soviet defensive lines before the Soviets could respond. The delays gave the Soviet engineers additional months to deepen those defensive lines. By July of 1943, the Kursk salient contained a defensive system of unprecedented depth, up to 300 kilometers of prepared positions, including anti-tank ditches, mine belts, artillery positions, and infantry strongpoints layered behind each other. The anti-tank mine density in the primary defensive zones reached approximately 1,500 mines per kilometer of front. Anti-tank mine per kilometer. The German assault formations had to pass through that. When Operation Citadel launched on the 5th of July, 1943, the Panther tanks that were supposed to anchor the southern assault were already in trouble. The Panther was a genuinely impressive design, well armored, mounting a powerful 75mm gun, superior in many respects to anything the Soviets had fielded. It was also, in its initial production variant, mechanically unfinished. The engine was prone to overheating and suffered from connecting rod-bearing failures under sustained load. The cooling system was inadequate. 2 Panthers caught fire on their tracks during the rail movement to the front, before a single enemy was encountered. On the first day of the assault, a significant number of the approximately 200 Panthers committed to the operation were immobilized by mechanical failure within hours of the start line. Exact figures are debated. German maintenance records from this period are incomplete. But the operational impact was measurable and immediate. The fighting in the northern sector around the Paniri railway junction was brutal and inconclusive from the start. The German Ninth Army, under Walter Model, drove into a defensive system so prepared that each German advance consumed formations that couldn't be replaced. In the south, the SS Panzer Corps, containing some of the best equipped German armoured formations on the Eastern Front, made deeper initial progress, but was grinding through defensive belts that had been specifically engineered to absorb exactly this kind of attack. The Soviets had mined the ground so thickly that German sappers working under fire couldn't clear lanes fast enough for the armoured assault to maintain momentum. By the 8th or 9th of July, it was becoming clear to German operational commanders, if not to Hitler, that the offensive was not achieving its intended breakthrough. The 12th of July, 1943, Prokhorovka. This is the event that has been described in Soviet historical accounts and in much popular Western writing derived from those accounts as the greatest tank battle in history, a massive Soviet armoured assault that shattered the German SS Panzer Corps and turned the tide of Kursk. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, under Colonel General Pavel Rotmistrov, charged the German positions in a massed assault. Tanks fought at close range. The battle was chaotic, violent, and decisive. That much is accurate. The rest needs to be examined against what the documents actually show. Rotmistrov filed an after-action report to Stavka 2 days after the battle. That report is now available to researchers, and it documents the 5th Guards Tank Army's losses at approximately 359 tanks and assault guns on the 12th of July, with more than 200 of those beyond repair. The German SS Panzer Corps, which had been defending prepared positions, lost approximately 70 to 80 tanks. The Soviet forces lost in the range of 4 to 5 vehicles for every German one. This is not a disputed number in the post-Soviet historiography. It is documented in Rotmistrov's own report, in the German SS Panzer Corps War Diary, and in the detailed archival research of Russian historian Valery Zamolin, whose book, Demolishing the Myth, produced what amounts to a forensic reconstruction of the battle from Soviet-side documents. Rotmistrov nearly faced a court-martial for the losses. The investigation was shelved, not because he was found innocent, but because acknowledging the investigation would have required acknowledging that Prokhorovka had been a Soviet tactical defeat. The public Soviet account published in 1944 described a decisive Soviet victory at Prokhorovka. The classified account said something completely different. Both documents existed simultaneously in the same institutional system. Someone made the decision that the public account and the true account would be different, and for 50 years the myth held. Because the Soviet archives were closed, because Rotmistrov's actual report was classified, because the German side's records were scattered and incomplete, and required cross-referencing with Soviet materials to tell the full picture. When Zamolin's research became available in English translation in 2011, it caused genuine controversy. Not because the archival argument was weak, it's very well documented, but because it required dismantling a monument that had been standing for 7 decades. What actually ended the German offensive at Kursk was not Prokhorovka, which was a costly Soviet tactical failure. What ended it was context. On the 10th of July, 2 days before Prokhorovka, the Allied landings in Sicily had begun, threatening Germany with the very two-front pressure that German strategic planning had always identified as existential. Hitler needed armoured reserves for Italy, the same reserves committed at Kursk. On the 12th of July, the day of Prokhorovka, Soviet Operation Kutuzov struck the German position at Orel, north of the Kursk salient, threatening to encircle the entire northern assault force. By the 17th of July, Hitler had ordered the withdrawal of the SS Panzer Corps from the salient. The tanks were needed elsewhere. The tactical question at Prokhorovka had become irrelevant, because the strategic context around it had shifted. The Soviets won at Kursk, not primarily because they outfought the Germans on the 12th of July. On that day, at Prokhorovka specifically, they didn't, but because they had prepared a defensive system deep enough to absorb German assault capacity, while holding strategic reserves to attack German vulnerabilities elsewhere simultaneously. There is something worth sitting with here about what it means when a nation builds its collective memory of a decisive event on a version of that event that its own commanders knew to be false. The Prokhorovka myth wasn't an accident of imperfect information. Rotmistrova's accurate report was in the system. The decision to replace it with a more comfortable account was a deliberate institutional choice. I'm not going to argue that this was unique to the Soviet Union. Military institutions across history have managed the relationship between operational truth and public narrative with varying degrees of honesty. But the specific Prokhorovka case is unusually clean as an example, because the two accounts, the true one and the official one, both survive in the archives, and the gap between them is precisely measurable. Chapter 10, The Commissar and the General, Command Culture at War. Konstantin Rokossovsky was arrested by the NKVD in 1937. He was one of the most capable cavalry and armoured commanders in the Red Army, a man who had been building his professional reputation across 15 years of increasingly demanding commands. During his approximately 3 years of imprisonment, he was tortured. His front teeth were knocked out. His ribs were broken. He endured multiple mock executions, the procedure in which a prisoner is led to a place of execution. A gun is put to their head, and the trigger is pulled on an empty chamber, or the prisoner is informed at the last moment that their sentence has been commuted. This was done to Rokossovsky more than once. He maintained his innocence throughout and refused to confess to the fabricated charges of being a foreign spy. In 1940, in the middle of the Finnish War, when the Red Army desperately needed competent commanders, he was released, rehabilitated, and given a corps command. 2 years later, Stalin gave him command of the Don Front at Stalingrad, and his operational management of the encirclement and destruction of the Sixth Army would be assessed by military historians as one of the finest corps of work by any commander in the war. None of this required Rokossovsky to have been released from prison. It just required that he still be alive. The story of Rokossovsky is the story of the Soviet command system in concentrated form. The same institution that produced the catastrophes of 1941, that executed its best officers, promoted based on political reliability rather than professional competence, that built a dual command structure where political officers could override tactical decisions. That institution was capable, under sufficient pressure and with specific reforms, of generating commanders of remarkable ability and operational sophistication. The question historians have been arguing about ever since is how. The answer, I think, is not inspirational. It's institutional. In October of 1942, 1 year after the disasters before Moscow, 9 months after the catastrophe at Kharkov, 1 month before Uranus would begin the Stalingrad encirclement, Stalin issued Order Number 307, abolishing the dual command system. The political commissar's veto power over military decisions was removed. Henceforth, the military commander commanded. The political officer remained as a morale and propaganda function, but without the authority to countermand operational orders. This decision is not dramatic. It is 4 paragraphs of administrative language that reversed 4 years of organizational structure. But it was the single most consequential institutional reform the Red Army made during the war, because it re-established the basic principle that in a military command, the person responsible for the outcome has to have authority over the decisions that create the outcome. This seems obvious. It had not been the Soviet practice. The purges that destroyed the Red Army's senior leadership in 1937 and 38 had a specific legacy that went beyond the loss of the individuals themselves. They had demonstrated, at institutional scale, what happened to professional military judgment when it contradicted political authority. The commanders who survived the purges had survived partly by learning not to report bad news accurately, not to make recommendations that might be interpreted as defeatist, not to exercise independent judgment in ways that could attract political attention. This is not speculation. It's documented in the behavior observed in the first months of Barbarossa, in commanders who didn't report encirclement truthfully, in men who requested withdrawal and were disciplined for the request. The purges didn't just kill officers. They taught the survivors a lesson about the cost of professional honesty. What happened between 1942 and 1944 was, in effect, a managed re-education of the Soviet military command culture, not through political liberalization, which didn't happen, but through the pragmatic recognition that armies need professional military judgment in tactical decisions, and that terror as a performance incentive produces a specific set of pathological behaviors incompatible with flexible operational response. The abolition of Commissar, command authority, was followed by a systematic process of identifying and advancing officers who had demonstrated competence, regardless of whether they had spent time in a gulag. Rokossovsky was not the only rehabilitated prisoner given major command. He was the most famous example of a wider pattern. The Soviet General Staff under Vasilevsky developed through 1943 and into 44 a planning process with genuinely no equivalent on the German side. Front commanders were summoned to Moscow, briefed on strategic objectives, and then sent back to develop their own operational plans, which were reviewed centrally and coordinated across multiple fronts simultaneously. This created what military theorists call nested planning. Strategic intent translating into operational design, translating into tactical orders with real communication at each level. The commanders weren't simply executing instructions handed down from above. They were designing the operations they would be responsible for executing within a framework of strategic objectives set by the center. Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev, Vatutin. These men were not interchangeable products of the system. They were professional soldiers who had survived the system and were now operating in it with a degree of genuine professional authority that would have been unthinkable in 1941. The German command system in the same period was moving in the opposite direction. The process of centralizing operational decision-making into Hitler's headquarters had been intensifying since at least 1942, and by 1943 it had reached a state where front commanders were required to seek approval for movements that any competent army would treat as tactical-level decisions. Paulus's experience at Stalingrad was the extreme example. A general who could see the operational situation clearly, who knew what needed to be done, and who waited for permission rather than acting. He waited because the system had been constructed to require waiting, and because the consequences of acting without authorization had been made viscerally clear across 4 years of command culture that punished independent judgment. The Maskirovka, the operational deception that accompanied Soviet planning for Operation Bagration in the spring and summer of 1944, represents what the reformed Soviet command system was capable of at full capacity. The movement of 2.5 million troops, more than 36,000 guns, 5,000 tanks, and 5,000 aircraft to the Belarusian sector, conducted over 9 months without German intelligence detecting the buildup. She required a coordination effort that would have been impossible in the 1941 Red Army. It required signals discipline at army group scale, the management of false radio traffic across hundreds of kilometers of front, the concealment of physical movement through night operations and camouflage, and the maintenance of deceptive appearances in areas the Soviets wanted the Germans to believe were the main attack sectors. German intelligence assessed that the Soviet summer offensive of 1944 would strike in Ukraine, where several false indicators were carefully maintained. When Bagration struck Belarusia on the 22nd of June 1944, exactly 3 years after Barbarossa, Army Group Center was not in a state of heightened alert. Its intelligence assessment from 2 days earlier rated a major attack in the sector as unlikely. There's a story about the planning of Bagration that I find almost impossibly illuminating. Rokossovsky, by this point commanding the First Belarusian Front, proposed to Stavka a 2-pronged main attack, 2 simultaneous axes of advance rather than the conventional single main effort. Stalin reportedly was skeptical. He asked Rokossovsky to step outside the room and reconsider. Rokossovsky went out, thought about it, came back, and proposed exactly the same thing again. Stalin, after a moment, approved it. The 2-axis approach is now assessed by military historians as one of the key operational innovations of Bagration, because it prevented German reserves from concentrating against either thrust. a man who had been tortured in a Soviet prison in 1937, a man who had survived 3 mock executions, walked back into a room with Stalin and said the same thing twice. That is either extraordinary professional courage or the clinical stubbornness of a man who had already survived the worst the system could do to him and found it less frightening the second time around. Chapter 11. Bagration. The operation nobody remembers. On the 22nd of June, 1944, 3 years to the day since Operation Barbarossa began, 166 Soviet divisions attacked Army Group Center across a 500-kilometer front in Belarusia. The German intelligence assessment, filed 2 days earlier, she had rated a major attack in this sector as unlikely. The Germans were expecting the summer offensive to fall on Army Group North Ukraine, where Soviet concentrations and false radio traffic had been carefully staged over months. They were not expecting what arrived in Belarusia on the morning of the 22nd of June. Bagration is the operation that determined the final outcome of the war on the Eastern Front. It destroyed Army Group Center, one of the 3 army groups with which Germany had launched Barbarossa, more completely than any single operation in the European war. Between the 22nd of June and the 4th of July, 1944, 12 days, Army Group Center lost 25 divisions and approximately 300,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. In the 3 weeks following, Germany lost another 100,000. Total casualties of somewhere between 400 and 500,000 in approximately 6 weeks. This exceeds the total German casualties at Stalingrad, which unfolded across 5 months. It is, by most measurable criteria, the greatest single defeat suffered by the German army in the Second World War, and it is almost completely unknown in Western popular history, because it began on the 6th of June, 1944, the same week as D-Day in Normandy, and the Western narrative of the war's conclusion has for 80 years been organized primarily around the Normandy campaign. The artillery preparation that opened Bagration on the 22nd of June is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it illustrates what the Soviet military had become by mid-1944. 9,500 guns and mortars on the primary assault axes. The opening bombardment on different sectors lasted between 90 minutes and 2 hours, delivering approximately 250,000 artillery rounds before the first Soviet infantrymen crossed the start line. German forward positions, according to Soviet Third Army operational records assessing the result, were described as suppressed to tactical irrelevance before the infantry moved. This is the difference between the Soviet Army of 1941, which attacked with artillery it didn't know how to coordinate, and the Soviet Army of 1944, which had spent 2 years learning exactly how to organize the mass application of firepower at the opening moment of an operation. The Feste Platz doctrine, Hitler's designation of certain cities as fortified places to be held regardless of encirclement, was the mechanism through which the German command system ensured that its tactical disasters in Belarusia became strategic catastrophes. Vitebsk and Bobruisk had both been designated Feste Platz. Both were rapidly surrounded by Soviet forces in the opening days. Vitebsk, with a garrison of approximately 35,000 men, was encircled by the 25th of June and destroyed by the 27th. The garrison commander, General Friedrich Gollwitzer, was captured. The Army Group Center War Diary records the loss of Vitebsk with the notation, "Fortress Vitebsk has fallen. Administrative. Routine." As though the loss of 35,000 men in 48 hours were a filing matter. Minsk fell on the 3rd of July, 1944. The German Fourth Army, or what remained of it, was encircled east of the city, approximately 105,000 men, trapped in a pocket they had no realistic means of breaking out of. The distance the front had been pushed back in 11 days was approximately 300 kilometers. The German front line that had stretched through Belarusia, from Vitebsk to Bobruisk to Minsk, had, in less than 2 weeks, ceased to exist. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, who had commanded Army Group Center since 1943 and who had faithfully implemented every one of Hitler's Festeplatz orders, regardless of their operational rationality, was relieved of command on the 28th of June. He was replaced by Walter Model, the Wehrmacht's most experienced crisis manager, a man whose ability to improvise defensive solutions from catastrophic starting positions had earned him the nickname Hitler's Fireman. Model arrived in Belarusia in late June and found what may have been the one situation in the entire war where his particular skills were insufficient to the problem. There was no front line to stabilize. There was no continuous line at all. The 17th of July, 1944, is a date that rarely appears in Western popular histories of the war. 57,600 German prisoners of war, men captured in the Bagration encirclements over the preceding 3 weeks, were marched through the streets of Moscow, not shuffled through a courtyard, marched through the city's main thoroughfares in columns under guard, observed by crowds of Muscovite civilians who had spent 3 years of the war within several hours of German forces. The march was filmed and broadcast globally. Behind the columns of prisoners, Moscow city workers cleaned the streets with hoses, a theatrical gesture of deliberate humiliation, prepared weeks in advance by Soviet propaganda authorities, that communicated with crystalline precision that these men and what they represented were being treated as a kind of filth. The German newsreel footage from 1941 had shown Soviet prisoners in exactly the same degraded condition, emaciated, shuffling, defeated. Moscow in July of 1944 was returning that image. The operational doctrine that made Bagration's scale possible was called successive operations. The principle that a major offensive should not pause to consolidate, but should be immediately followed by exploitation operations using fresh reserves, before the enemy can reconstitute a defensive line. This doctrine had been developed theoretically in the 1930s by Marshal Tukhachevsky, who was executed in 1937. His theoretical work survived him, was studied by surviving general staff theorists, and was reconstructed into operational practice through the campaigns of 1943 and 44. Tukhachevsky was rehabilitated posthumously in 1956. The doctrine that his execution had briefly suppressed had helped end the war 10 years earlier. Operation Bagration killed or captured more German soldiers in 6 weeks than the entire Normandy campaign did in approximately 11 months of fighting. This is not a commentary on the courage or competence of the Allied forces in Normandy. The Normandy campaign was fought against determined resistance and achieved everything it needed to achieve. It is a statement about scale. The Eastern Front, even in its final year, was conducting warfare at a magnitude that the Western theatre simply wasn't producing, and Bagration was the peak expression of that magnitude. A Soviet operational machine that had been built, reformed, bloodied, reformed again, and sharpened across 3 years of catastrophic learning, finally executing the operation it had spent those 3 years becoming capable of. Chapter 12. The Burning Villages, Occupation, Atrocity, and Resistance. This chapter begins with a document. It is 4 typed pages long. It was compiled on the 1st of December, 1941, by SS Standartenführer Karl Jäger, commander of Einsatzkommando 3, operating in Lithuania, under Einsatzgruppe A. At the top of the document is a number, 137,346. This is the number of people killed by Einsatzkommando 3 and its Lithuanian auxiliary collaborators between the 2nd of July and the 1st of December 1941. 5 months of operations. The body of the document is a tabular record of every killing operation. Date, location, categories of victims, and number killed. The categories are not euphemistic, they are specific. Each entry is formatted consistently, as though the operation were a production report, which, within the bureaucratic framework of this institution, it was. The Jaeger report is one of the most complete single records of a mobile killing unit's operations to survive the war. It exists because Jaeger kept it. He preserved it physically throughout the war and after. German investigators identified him in 1959 and issued an arrest warrant 1 year before his death, which means he was never tried. The document he had carefully maintained for nearly 2 decades after the events it recorded is now the primary archival evidence of what Einsatzkommando 3 did across a summer and autumn in Lithuania. The bureaucratic care with which the killing was documented is itself a form of evidence about the institutional framework within which it occurred. Someone taught the men of Einsatzkommando 3 to file reports in this format. Someone reviewed those reports. Someone signed off on them. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units deployed behind the advancing Wehrmacht in the Soviet Union, were not a separate operation from the Eastern Front. They traveled with the army, used army logistics, relied on army rear area security forces for some operations, and operated in a theatre where the Wehrmacht's own rear area security units were conducting their own killing operations against civilians under the umbrella of anti-partisan activity. The distinction between the Einsatzgruppen as the primary killing force and the Wehrmacht as a professional military organization that happened to be adjacent to them, a distinction that featured prominently in German post-war narrative and in the defense strategies of war crimes trials, has not survived serious archival scrutiny. The Wehrmacht exhibition that opened in Germany in 1995, Crimes of the Wehrmacht, presented photographic and documentary evidence from Wehrmacht archive records, documenting regular army participation in atrocities against civilians and Soviet prisoners. The exhibition was not produced by foreign historians with an agenda. It was produced by German historians using German records held in German archives. It caused a political crisis. Veterans' organizations denounced it. Some of the specific photographs were later found to have been misidentified, and the exhibition was withdrawn and revised. But the central argument that regular Wehrmacht units participated in atrocities on the Eastern Front as a matter of institutional practice, not as exceptional individual criminal behavior, was not overturned by the revision. It was strengthened by the more careful methodology of the revised exhibition in 2001. On the 29th and 30th of September 1941, 10 days after the fall of Kiev, Einsatzgruppe C, supported by German police battalions and Ukrainian auxiliary police, conducted operations at the Babin Yar ravine on the outskirts of Kiev. 33,771 people were killed in 2 days. This figure comes from the Einsatzgruppe's own after-action report. The ravine at Babin Yar became a killing site for the subsequent 2 years of German occupation, used for the execution of Soviet prisoners of war, Roma, psychiatric patients, and others. The occupation authorities determined to be threats or burdens or simply present. The total number killed at the site across the occupation period is estimated at over 100,000 people. After the war, The Soviet government built a park on the site, without a monument specific to the Jewish victims. A monument acknowledging the Jewish identity of the primary victims was not erected until 1991, when the Soviet Union no longer existed. The Soviet partisan movement, by 1943, she numbered approximately 250,000 fighters operating behind German lines, organized under the central headquarters of the partisan movement, itself controlled by the NKVD. The partisans were not primarily fighting German soldiers in direct action. Their primary operational function was rail sabotage. Operation Rail War, conducted in coordination with the Kursk defensive operation in August and September of 1943, involved approximately 1,600 rail-cut attacks along German supply lines in Belarusia. German rear area security reports from the period document the impact on supply capacity as significant. Trains delayed, track sections destroyed, repair crews working under fire. The partisans were an irregular force with limited weapons operating in occupied territory, and their contribution to the war's outcome operated through the logistics chain rather than the battlefield. The German response to partisan activity produced its own atrocity record, documented in the Wehrmacht's own rear area security reports, which used the category bandits or partisan suspects to cover a range of people, many of whom were civilians with no demonstrated partisan connection. The ratio of actual combatants to civilians killed in German anti-partisan operations, calculated from the operations reports themselves, frequently ran 10 civilians or more for every documented partisan fighter. Villages in areas with known partisan activity were burned as collective punishment under guidelines that had been issued before the invasion. The Barbarossa Decree pre-authorized this. The burning wasn't improvised in the field. It was permitted in writing from the start. It is not possible to discuss the German occupation of the Eastern Front without acknowledging the document known as General Plan Ost, the General Plan East, produced by the Reich Security Main Office, which laid out the intended post-war population restructuring of the conquered Eastern territories. The plan envisaged the elimination, deportation, or Germanization of approximately 31 million people from Eastern Europe to make physical room for German settlement. It was never fully implemented. The war's outcome prevented it, but elements of it were operational from the beginning of the occupation. The starvation policies applied to Soviet prisoners of war, the deliberate reduction of food allocations to occupied civilian populations below subsistence levels, the systematic killing of populations categorized as racially or politically undesirable. These were not departures from policy. They were the policy. What I find most difficult to communicate about this chapter, and I've thought about how to say it carefully, is the relationship between the institutional and the individual. The men who committed these operations were not, in the ordinary biographical sense, monsters distinguishable from their neighbors and colleagues. They were men inside an institutional framework that defined killing as administration, that provided a bureaucratic language for mass murder, that rewarded operational efficiency and created structures of authority within which personal moral objection was career-ending or life-ending. The Jaeger report is 4 pages long. Jaeger filed it as routine. Someone designed the form. Chapter 13. The Architecture of Soviet Suffering. The home front, Antonina Piroshkova, was an engineer. Before the war, she had been one of the lead designers on the Moscow metro, one of the few women working in Soviet subway construction at that technical level, a fact that required a specific kind of tenacity to maintain in an institution that didn't expect her to be there. Her companion of nearly a decade was the writer Isaac Babel, who was arrested by the NKVD in 1939 and shot in January of 1940. One of the thousands of cultural and intellectual figures consumed by the purges. Piroshkova learned of his death years later, when the war was already over. Through the war years, she worked. She kept engineering. She didn't know whether he was alive or dead. She worked. Her memoir, which is written decades later, is one of the most precise personal accounts of what the Soviet wartime home front actually felt like from the inside. Not the heroic propaganda version, but the version in which a woman who had lost her companion to the state continued to serve the state because there was no alternative and because the work was real. I begin with Piroshkova, not because her story is representative. It's too specific, too educated, too metropolitan, but because she wrote it down honestly, and honest accounts of what the Soviet home front asked of its people are rarer than the casualty statistics. The statistics are enormous. Between 1941 and 1945, women came to constitute approximately 57% of the Soviet industrial workforce, up from roughly 38% in 1940. In agriculture, the figure reached approximately 80%, because virtually every able-bodied man between 17 and 45 had been conscripted. Soviet women in 1943 were simultaneously managing collective farm labor, without the male workforce that had previously done the heaviest physical tasks, working factory shifts of 11 to 12 hours minimum, raising children on wartime rations, and doing all of this under a labor law regime that criminalized absenteeism and unauthorized absence from your designated workplace. The June 1940 decree that established this legal framework had not been suspended for the wartime emergency. It had been extended into it. The specific conditions inside the Ural factory complexes, Tankograd and its associated facilities, are documented in Soviet industrial records from the period. Worker accommodation at the Nizhny Tagil complex in 1942 shows that a significant number of workers slept on the factory floor, not because accommodation was unavailable elsewhere, but because the distances between the hastily constructed barracks and the factory floor were too far to cover and still maintain the shift schedule. Factory medical records from the same year document widespread clinical malnutrition among workers in the priority labor category, meaning these were people receiving the highest official ration allocation, not the dependents, not the unproductive. The priority workers, the people whose output mattered most to the war effort, were clinically malnourished. The ration that kept them functional was insufficient to sustain them over time. This is not an edge case. It is what the system required of the people who kept it running. The labor prosecution records deserve to be stated plainly. Soviet NKVD records document approximately 7.2 million prosecutions under the wartime labor discipline laws. Of those, around 2 million received custodial sentences, including assignment to the Gulag. The Gulag population, which had briefly declined in 1941 as prisoners were conscripted into military service, climbed back toward its wartime maximum of approximately 1.7 million by 1944. There is a specific, grim irony in the fact that the same institutional apparatus that had helped destroy the Red Army's officer corps in 1937 and 38 was, by 1943, prosecuting factory workers for missing shifts. The function had changed. The machinery was the same. A woman who collapsed at her workstation from exhaustion and was subsequently late to the next shift was, under the legal framework, subject to the same category of prosecution as a man who had deliberately sabotaged production. The distinction between collapse and delinquency did not exist in the statute. What the Soviet state called this experience, the word it applied publicly and in official communications, was heroic labor. This phrase appears in wartime speeches, in industrial award certificates, in newspaper headlines. It is not wrong, exactly. The labor was heroic in the literal sense. It exceeded what any reasonable standard of human capacity should have been asked to supply. But the framing converts compulsion into voluntary sacrifice, which converts administrative violence into national virtue. The women who worked 11-hour shifts in -20-degree Ural winters on inadequate food weren't choosing heroism. They were meeting the conditions of their employment, which were the conditions of a state that had made leaving those conditions illegal. The heroism was real. The choice component of it was not. Antonina Piroshkova is interesting precisely because she was not, by any normal accounting, a victim of this system in the straightforward sense. She was educated, technically skilled. She was working in a field that valued her output enough to maintain her at a relatively protected level. Her NKVD file was presumably active. The widow of an arrested man was a category of surveillance subject. And yet she worked, was maintained, was not arrested. She navigated the wartime system by being useful to it. This is the normal condition of survival in a totalitarian state during an existential war. You make yourself necessary to the machine, and the machine keeps you alive as a byproduct of its own functioning. Whether this is called heroism or simply adaptation depends on whether you're writing the official history or the honest one. Soviet grain production in 1942 was approximately 29.7 million tons. In 1940, before the German occupation of Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, it had been approximately 95.5 million tons. That is a reduction to roughly 30% of pre-war output, achieved through a combination of occupied territory, wholesale loss of male agricultural labor to conscription, and the disruption of both the collective farm system and the machine tractor stations. The food that remained had to supply both the army, which required a substantial and prioritized caloric allocation, and a civilian population across 11 time zones. Rural civilians in unoccupied Soviet territory were, by multiple accounts and documented in NKVD provincial reports, surviving on something in the range of 1,200 calories per day through much of the war. This is a level at which adults lose approximately half a kilogram of body weight per week. Over 4 years, this is not a statistical footnote. It is a population slowly consuming itself. The Order of Mother Heroine was established in 1944, awarded to women who had given birth to 10 or more children. Between 1944 and 1991, approximately 431,000 Soviet women received it. During the war years themselves, the Soviet birth rate collapsed to approximately 30% of its pre-war level. Every demographic indicator that might have produced a qualifying mother was moving in exactly the wrong direction. The medal existed in a period of demographic catastrophe as a piece of symbolic projection, the state imagining the family it wanted while the war consumed the families it had. It was also, in its own way, an instruction. Fertility as national duty. The womb as a productive asset to be optimized. The same institutional framework that criminalized leaving your factory shift extended in this form into the biological. There is a coda to all of this that I want to include, because it seems to me to be honestly part of the story. Of the approximately 2.6 million disabled veterans discharged from the Red Army before the war's end, a large proportion returned to villages and industrial towns where the female workforce had been managing everything. Agricultural work, factory shifts, household provision, child rearing. For 3 or 4 years. the reintegration of physically and psychologically damaged men into communities that had reorganized themselves around female labor, and female management created social pressures that Soviet provincial records document in some detail, though official historiography suppressed them. These are not comfortable stories. They don't fit the victory narrative, but they're part of the same accounting as the tank production figures and the ration cards, and Antonina Piroshkova, working in an engineering office while not knowing whether her companion was alive or dead, because the state that employed her had killed him and hadn't told her yet. Chapter 14. Romania, Hungary, Finland. The satellites that were not Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim was 73 years old when Finland went to war with the Soviet Union for the second time, in June of 1941. He was a former officer of the Tsar's Imperial Russian Army. He had served with distinction through the Russo-Japanese War and the First World War. A Finnish aristocrat, a deeply conservative man, and the military commander of a democratic republic that had just survived a Soviet invasion 18 months earlier and was now nominally fighting alongside Nazi Germany to recover the territory that invasion had cost. He had spent decades navigating a country caught between two empires. He understood what it meant to exist in proximity to a force that could absorb you, and he had made the political calculation that the only way Finland survived was by keeping its objectives narrow, its commitments limited, and its independence, in the deepest sense, intact. The Finnish Supreme Headquarters Order from the 6th of December 1941. Finland's Independence Day, chosen with obvious deliberation, instructed Finnish forces to halt their advance at the 1940 border. Not the border that Germany thought Finland should advance to. Not the border that would have closed the northern ring around Leningrad and given German forces the pincer they wanted. The 1940 border, the line that the Winter War had cost Finland and whose recovery was Finland's actual objective. German liaison officers filed a formal protest. Mannerheim acknowledged the protest and continued the halt. This one decision, a 73-year-old general choosing the limit of his country's war aims against the explicit preferences of the partner he depended on for material, may have been the most consequential act of strategic restraint by any military commander in the entire conflict. A Finnish advance on Leningrad from the north, coordinated with the German advance from the south, she would in all probability have completed the encirclement of the city in September of 1941. Mannerheim declined. The city survived 900 days, partly because a Finnish officer decided his country's war was not the same as Germany's war. He never fully explained why in written records accessible to historians. His memoirs are careful and characteristically understated on the subject. What can be inferred from the overall pattern of his decisions is that Mannerheim understood something that many of his German counterparts did not. A state's survival depends on its ability to exit an alliance before the alliance destroys it. Finland had limited war aims. It would fight to recover its territory. It would not fight Germany's war of annihilation. This distinction, visible throughout the Finnish conduct of the continuation war from 1941 to 1944, gave Finland the political capital with the Western Allies to negotiate a separate armistice in September of 1944, to turn its weapons on the German forces that had been in northern Finland, and to emerge from the most catastrophic war in European history as the only German ally to maintain its democracy, its sovereignty, and its territorial integrity. The restraint was not sentimentality, it was strategy. The Romanian experience on the Eastern Front occupies the opposite end of the spectrum from Finland's. Romania's participation in Barbarossa was genuine and substantial. The Romanian army was the fourth largest Axis contributor on the Eastern Front, committing hundreds of thousands of men across the Caucasus and Stalingrad campaigns. But Romania's participation was built on a set of misalignments that became structurally catastrophic by 1942. Romanian forces were equipped with anti-tank guns that were obsolete against Soviet armor. Romanian infantry divisions had little air support and limited artillery, and the Romanian forces at Stalingrad were placed on the flanks of the German Sixth Army, the most exposed and tactically demanding positions on the entire front, at a moment when Soviet planning was specifically targeting those flanks. Romanian Third Army intelligence officers filed reports in October of 1942 documenting extensive Soviet concentrations opposite their sector, warning of a major attack, and requesting more capable anti-tank weapons and German armoured reserves for support. The reports travelled up the German chain of command. They were assessed as alarmist and not acted on. The German formations that held the sectors immediately adjacent to the Romanian ones had been equipped with 75mm Pak-40 anti-tank guns, weapons that could effectively engage Soviet T-34s. The Romanians had 37mm Pak-36 weapons, which were operationally useless against the same tanks. This disparity was documented, reported, and not remedied before Operation Uranus struck on the 19th of November, 1942. The Romanian Third Army collapsed in approximately 48 hours. The German post-war narrative about Stalingrad assigned significant blame to Romanian military performance. Romanian post-war and post-communist historical accounts have pushed back on this with understandable vigor, noting that Romanian forces were placed in positions that German forces had refused to hold at weaponry levels that German planners had assessed as inadequate. Both things can be true. Romanian forces were less effective than German formations and were also placed in an impossible situation with insufficient weapons. The question of how much of the Stalingrad catastrophe is attributable to Romanian incapacity versus German operational choices about how to use Allied forces is genuinely contested, and I'm not going to pretend it has a clean answer. What does have a clean historical record is Romania's exit from the war in August of 1944. King Michael of Romania orchestrated a coup against Ion Antonescu's pro-German government on the 23rd of August, 1944, switching Romania to the Allied side in the space of a single day. Within 24 hours, Romanian forces were disarming German troops in Bucharest. The Ploiești oil complex, which had been supplying approximately 4.8 million tons of crude oil annually to the German war machine, roughly 35% of total Axis aviation fuel production, was now in Allied-aligned hands. The German Luftwaffe had been struggling with fuel shortages since at least 1943, driven partly by Allied strategic bombing and partly by the difficulty of maintaining supply chains under Allied air interdiction. The loss of Ploiești in a single day, via a palace coup rather than a military operation, was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe's operational capacity in the final year of the war was partly shaped by what happened in Bucharest on a single evening in August. Hungary's trajectory was darker. When Hungary began armistice negotiations with the Soviet Union in October of 1944, Germany launched Operation Panzerfaust, a coup that kidnapped the Hungarian regent's son, installed the Arrow Cross fascist movement in power, and forced Hungary's continued participation in the war through the most destructive possible mechanism, a siege. Budapest was surrounded by Soviet forces in late December of 1944 and fell after approximately 50 days of fighting in February of 1945, with casualties on both sides and in the civilian population running into six figures. The city was systematically destroyed in the process. Hungary's inability to exit the war on its own terms, because Germany was willing to install a puppet government rather than permit a strategic withdrawal, produced exactly the outcome that Mannerheim had spent 4 years engineering Finland to avoid. There is a specific reason why the Finnish case matters beyond the historical narrative, and it's worth stating directly. Finland is the existence proof that it was possible, under the conditions of the Eastern Front, for a small nation to make choices that distinguished its war from Germany's war, to maintain those distinctions under pressure, and to survive the consequences. This doesn't retroactively excuse Finnish territorial ambitions or the military alliance with Germany that made the continuation war possible. But it does demonstrate that the Eastern Front was not a single monolithic enterprise in which all participants were swept by the same tide. Some chose their limits carefully. The ones that chose carefully survived. Chapter 15. The Rasputitsa. Chapter When Geography Was the Enemy. The Russian word Rasputitsa translates literally as the time without roads. Not the time of bad roads or the time of difficult roads. The time when roads cease to exist. This is not a metaphor. The Russian language embedded into a single word, a seasonal reality so fundamental to existence in the Western Russian plain that it required its own noun, a condition not described by reference to weather or terrain, but acknowledged as a defining temporal category, the way other languages have words for the space between seasons. The people who had been living in that landscape for centuries named it correctly. The German military planners who built their operational schedules around the Russian transportation network had not, in any meaningful sense, accounted for it. The Rasputitsa occurred twice annually, once in autumn when the first frosts broke and the subsoil thawed, and once in spring when the deeper freezes released. The autumn Rasputitsa typically ran through October and into November. The spring version ran through March and April. These were not weeks of slippery roads. They were weeks in which the steppe soil, having released its frost-bound water, became a matrix of fine clay particles saturated to the point where weight-bearing capacity essentially disappeared. Vehicles didn't slow in Rasputitsa mud, they sank into it. The mud generated negative pressure, suction, around any object penetrating its surface, so that pulling a stuck vehicle free required forces substantially greater than pushing it in. The German Army Group's South Supply Report from the 15th of October, 1941, describes a paved road as impassable for wheeled vehicles. The mud defeated asphalt. The Wehrmacht's truck fleet in the central sector lost approximately 40% of its operational vehicles to mechanical failure, immobilization, or accident during the autumn Rasputitsa of 1941, within 3 weeks of the season's onset. The Army Group Center Vehicle Status Report from late October 1941 shows operational truck availability at approximately 35% of authorized strength. This is not 40% degraded from a comfortable starting point. This is the offensive that was supposed to take Moscow, now running supply operations with roughly 1 vehicle in 3 functional. The offensive continued. It continued on horses, on human portage, on commandeered local carts, and slowed, as the documents uniformly record, not because the men stopped fighting, but because the physical means of supplying them had been consumed by weather that German logisticians had technically known about and operationally not planned for. The spring Rasputitsa of 1943 has a specific operational significance that gets lost in the standard narrative of Kursk. The German assault on the Kursk salient Operation Citadel, was originally planned for May of 1943. Hitler postponed it repeatedly to allow the new Panther and Tiger tank models to arrive in sufficient numbers. The postponements were partly driven by these mechanical and production delays, but the spring Rasputitsa was also a factor. The ground conditions in April and early May simply didn't support the kind of mass armoured assault that Citadel required. Each additional week of delay gave Soviet engineers more time to deepen the Kursk defensive system. The mine density that ultimately consumed German assault capacity in July reached its extraordinary levels, 1,500 anti-tank mines per kilometre in primary defensive zones. Because the Germans waited for conditions that wouldn't kill their tanks mechanically before the enemy killed them tactically. The Rasputitsa gave the Soviets months. The Soviets used them. The comparison between German and Soviet mobility in Rasputitsa conditions is not a cultural observation. It is documented in comparative logistics data. The Soviet logistical units operating the American Studebaker US 6x6 trucks delivered under Lend-Lease achieved supply delivery rates during Rasputitsa periods approximately 2.5 times higher than German equivalent units at similar distances. The Studebaker's specifications explain why. 280 millimeters of ground clearance against a standard German truck's approximately 160 millimeters, six-wheel drive distributing load across more contact points, and wider tires generating lower ground pressure per square centimeter. The truck was designed for American construction and agricultural use in peacetime. It happened to have been engineered around the exact parameters that Rasputitsa demanded. The Germans had no comparable vehicle in adequate numbers because the Shell program, the pre-war attempt to standardize German military vehicles and reduce the number of types from hundreds to dozens, had partially failed, and even the standardized vehicles were optimized for European road conditions rather than the specific challenge of the Russian plain. 151,053 Studebaker US 6 trucks were delivered to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. I spend time on this because it's one of the statistics that most cleanly demonstrates what the war on the Eastern Front actually looked like at the operational level. These trucks moved approximately 4.8 million tons of supplies to Soviet frontline units during the war. Zhukov acknowledged after the war that without them, the Red Army's deep offensive operations, Bagration, the Vistula Oder offensive, the operations that drove from the Soviet border to Berlin, could not have been executed at the pace and scale that made them decisive. The Studebaker from South Bend, Indiana, was arguably one of the most strategically significant individual weapon systems on the Eastern Front. This is not an argument about American industrial might displacing Soviet sacrifice. It is an argument about what specific technical capabilities, applied to specific terrain conditions, actually determine at the operational level. The German road-building effort in occupied Soviet territory was substantial and largely futile. Die Wehrmacht, railway engineering. Records document the construction or improvement of approximately 60,000 kilometers of roads between 1941 and 1944 in the occupied East. The Rasputitsa destroyed a significant portion of these improvements with each cycle, requiring reconstruction the following year. The Germans were building roads that the climate dismantled on a predictable schedule, in a logistical treadmill that consumed engineering resources without ever creating a reliable foundation. Soviet engineers, working with the same terrain, had spent decades building a logistical culture around the Rasputitsa rather than against it. Corduroy roads of laid timber for the worst periods, pre-positioned supply caches, and operational planning schedules built around the seasonal calendar rather than pretending the season could be engineered away. The T-34's track width is a small detail with a large implication. Soviet tank designers had specified a track 500 mm wide for the T-34, against the 400 mm of the Panzer IV, the primary German medium tank. A wider track distributes the vehicle's weight across more surface area, generating lower ground pressure per square centimetre. The T-34's ground pressure was approximately 5.7 pounds per square inch. The Tiger one's was approximately 14.7 pounds per square inch, and in Rasputitsa conditions, it could and did sink until the hull contacted the ground and the tracks lost contact, what engineers called bellying out. The T-34's designers built their vehicle for the ground it would actually fight on. The Tiger's designers built their vehicle for the firepower and armor requirements defined by a tactical doctrine that didn't adequately account for mobility in Russian conditions. Both design decisions were rational within their own frameworks. Only one of the frameworks included a realistic model of where the vehicle would be fighting. Chapter 16. The Bitter Road, West, Atrocity in Retreat and Advance. In the summer of 1944, Vasily Grossman visited the site of the Treblinka extermination camp in occupied Poland. He was a war correspondent for the Red Army newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, and he had been following Soviet forces since Barbarossa began in 1941. He was also a Jew born in the Ukrainian city of Berdichev, and he had spent 3 years watching the war with the specific knowledge of what German occupation meant for the people who shared his background. By the time he reached Treblinka in September of 1944, the camp had been dismantled. The Germans had ploughed the site. Grass and wildflowers were growing over the ground. There was almost nothing to see in any ordinary sense. Grossman found one survivor, spoke with him for hours, and then wrote 12 pages in his notebook that he did not submit to his newspaper. His published essay, The Hell of Treblinka, she's written after that visit and published in November of 1944, was one of the first extended accounts in any language of what an extermination camp had actually been and done. It was read into evidence at the Nuremberg trials. But the notebook pages, the raw version, the one he kept rather than submitted, contained material that the censors would not have passed, and that Grossman himself chose not to put into the official record. These notebooks, published decades later in the collection, edited by Antony Beevor and Luba Vinogradova as a writer at war, form one of the most unusual primary source documents in the entire Eastern Front archive. A journalist's private reckoning, in real time, with what the war he'd been covering for 3 years had actually been made of. The winter and spring of 1944 and 1945 produced a specific category of event that is genuinely difficult to describe without doing injustice to its complexity. Soviet forces advancing westward through Poland, Romania, and eventually into Germany encountered simultaneously the most horrifying evidence of what German occupation had produced: the death camps, the mass graves, the systematic destruction of entire populations, and committed their own substantial catalogue of atrocities against civilian populations in their path. These two facts are not in tension. They are both true and both documented, and the only intellectually honest position is to hold them together rather than resolving the discomfort by emphasizing one at the expense of the other. On the 27th of January, 1945, the Soviet 100th and 322nd Rifle Divisions entered the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex and found approximately 7,000 surviving prisoners. The remainder left behind when the Germans force-marched the bulk of the camp's population westward in January. The soldiers who walked through those gates had seen a great deal of what war produced. Several of them left accounts that used language outside their normal documentary register. They found themselves writing in ways that their training as military correspondents and their experience of 4 years on the Eastern Front had not prepared them for. The Soviet Divisional Intelligence Report for that day is a straightforward military document in its structure. In its middle section, the officer writing it states that he has no adequate words for what is here. The report was classified. The language was not the language of a report. It was the language of a man writing from beyond the boundary of what professional vocabulary could contain. The German civilian population of East Prussia, approximately 2.4 million people, had been denied permission to evacuate their homes through most of 1944 by Nazi authorities who had decided that authorizing evacuation would convey strategic pessimism and damage morale. The evacuation, when it finally came, was authorized in January of 1945, in the depths of winter, with Soviet forces already deep inside East Prussian territory. The resulting movement, millions of people on foot, in carts, on overcrowded trains, in ships across the Baltic, produced a humanitarian catastrophe shaped by the combination of winter conditions, Soviet advance, and the particular cruelty of authorizing movement only when movement had become most dangerous. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff by the Soviet submarine S-13 on the 30th of January 1945 killed between 7,000 and 9,300 refugees, men, women, and children who had been packed onto a converted cruise ship at approximately 5 times its peacetime capacity, in Baltic waters at temperatures of approximately -18 degrees Celsius. This is the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history. The commanding officer of S-13, Captain Alexander Marinesco, was subsequently decorated. The Gustloff was a legitimate military target under the laws of war as they existed and as they applied. The civilian death toll was an outcome of the conditions of the evacuation, conditions created by Nazi authorities who had refused to authorize departure until departure had become lethal. All of these things are simultaneously true. The documented behavior of Red Army soldiers toward German and Eastern European civilian populations in the final year of the war is a subject that occupied Anthony Beevor in Berlin. The downfall, and has been addressed in varying degrees of completeness and honesty by subsequent historians using converging German, Soviet, and third-party sources. The scale of sexual violence in particular against German women and against women in countries the Red Army passed through, including Poland and Hungary, is documented in survivor testimonies, in German medical records from occupation hospitals, in Soviet political commissar reports that acknowledge the problem and record the orders attempting to address it. The estimates that Beevor's research produced up to 2 million incidents of rape across the German and Eastern European campaign areas are contested by Russian historians. They are not invented. The Commissar reports that records Soviet military command attempting to restrain this behavior through orders are themselves evidence that the behavior was occurring at a scale requiring institutional response. Zhukov himself issued orders in April of 1945, attempting to restrain his soldiers. The orders had limited effect. The political commissar reports from that period contain a specific kind of language, the language of institutional responsibility, acknowledging a situation that institutional authority cannot fully control, that is more revealing than either the denial or the maximalist account. There was a system of official orders prohibiting these acts. The orders were being issued because the acts were happening. Both facts are in the record. The Warsaw Uprising of August to October 1944 sits at the intersection of military history and political crime, in a way that has generated controversy continuously since it occurred. The Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, rose against German occupation on the 1st of August 1944, while Soviet forces held positions on the eastern bank of the Vistula River, roughly 10 kilometers from the city. The uprising fought for 63 days, waiting for Soviet support that did not come in any meaningful form. German forces suppressed it with a thoroughness that destroyed approximately 90% of Warsaw's buildings and killed between 150,000 and 200,000 Polish civilians and fighters. Soviet archival research conducted after the Soviet collapse has produced evidence that the halt of Soviet forces at the Vistula was not solely a military necessity. Soviet offensive capacity in that sector had been genuinely stretched by the pace of Bagration, but also reflected a political calculation. The Home Army was loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, not to the Soviet-aligned Polish Committee that Moscow was preparing to install as the legitimate government of post-war Poland. A Warsaw liberated by the Home Army would have been a political problem. A Warsaw destroyed, its Home Army eliminated, and its resistance infrastructure broken was not. Soviet forces entered Warsaw in January of 1945, after it had been reduced to rubble and the Home Army had been effectively destroyed. This sequence of events shaped Polish-Soviet and Polish-Russian relations for the remainder of the 20th century and, in specific ways, into the present. Grossman continued writing throughout all of this. He had a particular habit, documented in multiple accounts of his working method, of finding the one person in any situation who was willing to speak accurately about what they had seen. The survivor at Treblinka, the soldier outside Stalingrad, the woman in a village destroyed by German forces. He wrote it all down in notebooks, and some of it went to the newspaper and some of it didn't, and the part that didn't has turned out to be, in certain respects, the more important record. There is something in that, in the gap between what can be published and what needs to be written down anyway, that seems to me to be both the most honest and the most human thing in this entire story. Chapter 17. The ruins are the record, what the Eastern Front left behind. A Soviet State Planning Commission report from July of 1945, 5 weeks after the war ended, begins with a list. 1,710 towns and cities destroyed, 70,000 villages destroyed, 32,000 industrial enterprises destroyed, 65,000 kilometers of railway track destroyed, 6 million buildings destroyed. The report calculates the approximate reconstruction cost and arrives at a figure of 262,000 million rubles. Then it proceeds, in the dry language of state accounting, to the question of labor and materials allocation. The war is in the past tense in this document. The accounting has begun. Someone has already moved on to the spreadsheet of rebuilding the thing that had just been destroyed, and the spreadsheet itself is a kind of document about what the Eastern Front cost, not the human cost, which doesn't reduce to rubles, but the physical cost, the cost that can be counted and entered into columns and assigned to budget lines. The war ended twice. On the 7th of May, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed the German instrument of unconditional surrender at Allied Supreme Headquarters in Reims, France, at 2:41 in the morning. This was the surrender. It was legally complete and operationally effective. Stalin refused to accept it. He refused not because there was a procedural defect. The document was valid, but because the war that the Soviet Union had fought was not, in his understanding, a war that could end in an American building in France. The Soviet Union had lost somewhere between 26 and 27 million people. It had fought from the Volga to the Elbe. Its forces had taken Berlin. The ceremony of surrender needed to happen somewhere that acknowledged what that meant. On the 8th of May, in Berlin-Karlshorst, Schiele's second ceremony was held at Soviet insistence. The same document was signed again. This redundancy, a legal instrument executed twice because one party refused the political symbolism of the first occasion, was the opening act of the Cold War. Before the guns were fully silent, the two sides of the wartime alliance had already demonstrated that they understood the meaning of victory differently and were not going to resolve that difference through argument. The Soviet total death toll from the Eastern Front is one of the genuinely uncertain numbers in modern historical research, and the uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship. It is a product of what happens to record keeping in a country that loses over a quarter of its population. Soviet wartime statistics reported 6.8 million military deaths. The first major post-Soviet revision by General Krivashev's research team, published in 1993, raised this to 8.7 million military dead. Independent demographic analysis by various scholars has produced ranges running from roughly 8 million to estimates considerably higher, depending on methodology and what categories of death are included. The civilian toll, deaths attributable to enemy action, occupation, famine, disease, and the compounding effects of wartime conditions, adds a further estimated 16 to 20 million, bringing the broadly accepted total to somewhere around 26 to 27 million Soviet dead. The uncertainty in this number is itself significant. The Soviet state did not have the administrative capacity to accurately count all its dead. The scale had exceeded the record. The 1959 Soviet census, the first conducted after the war, 14 years after its conclusion, documented a sex ratio of approximately 77 men per 100 women in the age cohort, then between 25 and 49. In the territory that is now Russia, by 1950, there were 76.5 men per 100 women. This is the demographic shadow of the Eastern Front, legible in census data collected over a decade after the war ended. The imbalance shaped marriage rates, fertility patterns, household structures, the distribution of productive and care labor between men and women, and the social organization of Soviet society through at least the 1970s. Demographic economists working on Soviet post-war data have documented the measurable effects on marriage and family formation that this imbalance produced, effects traceable in the data for decades after the last shot was fired. The war is over in the census numbers. It is also still present. Germany was divided. Poland was moved westward, its eastern territories absorbed by the Soviet Union, its western territories compensated with former German land. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, whose sovereignty had been quietly transferred in the secret additional protocol of August 1939, were formally incorporated into the Soviet Union and would remain there for almost 50 years. Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, just as in Eastern Germany, fell within the Soviet sphere of control that the military outcome of the Eastern Front had produced, and communist governments installed through combinations of Soviet pressure, NKVD operation, and electoral manipulation replaced the political structures that had existed before the war. The Molotov-Ribbentrop framework, two great powers deciding the political arrangements of smaller countries through bilateral agreement, was not abandoned after the war. It was continued by one of the two parties in the form of a post-war settlement that most of the affected populations had not chosen and could not refuse. The Great Patriotic War, The Soviet designation for the conflict, still in use in Russia, is a phrase that does not contain the word victory. This is worth pausing on. Velikaya Oteshestvenaya Vojna. Great, patriotic war. What the Soviet state chose to commemorate was participation and endurance, not triumph. The myth was organized around suffering and survival, rather than around what was won, which is itself revealing about what the people who built the myth understood had actually happened. 26 million dead is not a victory in any ordinary sense of the word. It is a survival at a cost that bends the meaning of winning towards something else entirely. The Eastern Front did not produce a clean resolution. It produced the Iron Curtain, the Cold War, 50 years of divided Europe, several generations of suppressed national memory in the countries of the former Soviet bloc, and a set of contested historical accounts that were still being argued over in archives and courtrooms and national parliaments in 2025. The Warsaw Uprising is one of the reasons Polish-Russian relations have been what they are. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is one of the reasons the Baltic states sought NATO membership with a specific urgency. The specific territorial outcomes of the 1944 and 45 campaigns are directly present in where borders were drawn and what populations live where today in Eastern and Central Europe. The Eastern Front is not archaeology. The Eastern Front is the foundation on which the present moment is built. I want to end with a number that I've been carrying through this entire series, because I don't think it's honest to end without confronting it directly. Somewhere around 26 to 27 million Soviet people died because of this war. That number encompasses soldiers killed in battle, soldiers who died in German captivity, civilians who starved in the occupation zone or in Leningrad or behind the lines, civilians who were killed in German anti-partisan operations or in Einsatzgruppen actions, people who died from disease or cold, or the compounding consequences of wartime conditions in ways that will never be fully attributed. The number is uncertain at the margins. At the center, it is very large. It exceeds, by a factor of at least 10, the total military deaths of the United States across every war it has fought in its entire history. Every one of those 26 or 27 million deaths was preceded by a moment in which someone made a decision. A pact was signed on the 23rd of August, 1939. An order was issued on the 22nd of June, 1941. A supply was not sent. A withdrawal was forbidden. A report was filed, classified, and replaced with a more comfortable version. A factory director was arrested for missing a quota. A political commissar stamped a report, defeatist. A ration card was issued with 125 grams on it. The Eastern Front was not a natural disaster. It was a sequence of choices made by institutions and individuals who are in many cases named and documented, whose decisions have been archived and studied and are available for examination by anyone who wants to look. That is what makes it history rather than catastrophe. And that distinction between things that simply happened and things that were chosen is the only reason this kind of record matters at all.